Section 7, the American Presidency. Chapter 47, Who Controls the American Presidency? At this moment in time, the American people have no say-so in determining who their next president will be. Zero, none, zilch. How can I make such a drastic statement? Well, if reading the articles on vote scam later in this book don't convince you, then check out this observation by noted researcher Susan George. Economists generally agree that if 55% or more of a given market is controlled by 4 or fewer companies, then an oligopoly exists, end quote. An oligopoly is defined as control by a few competing sellers of the amount and price of a given product or service to a large number of buyers. Thus, in regard to the selection as opposed to election of our president, there are 3 organizations which determine not only who is chosen for that office, but also its cabinet and policies. They are the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, and the Bilderbergs. In this sense, the United States has gone from being a democracy to that of an oligarchy. We are the bamboozled buyers who are getting suckered by the illusion provided to us by the sellers. In this chapter, I'm going to lay a groundwork that will show how the 3 above listed organizations have controlled the executive office from the Nixon and Carter administrations all the way up to the current one. The most disturbing aspect of this phenomenon is the virtual lock that these groups have on our highest office. In other words, how would you feel if every president in the last 50 years was a Hare Krishna, a plumber, or belonged to the Knights of Columbus? Would it unnerve you or make you think something suspicious was taking place? It should, for this is exactly what's going on today. Only the 3 main groups involved are the CFR, the Trilateral Commission, and the Bilderbergs, all led by the nefariously scheming David Rockefeller. Before I begin, please allow me to run a few quotes by you to set the stage. Sir William Pitts, addressing the House of Lords in England, 1770. There is something behind the throne greater than the king himself, end quote. Felix Frankfurter, former U.S. Supreme Court Justice. The real rulers in Washington are invisible and exercise power from behind the scenes, end quote. Abraham Lincoln, if destruction be our lot, we ourselves must be its author and finisher, end quote. Walter Bernays in Propaganda, those who manipulate the unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government which is the true ruling power of our country. Our minds are molded largely by men we have never heard of, end quote. The Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderbergs, and the Trilateral Commission was formed in 1921, and one of its early influential members, Colonel Edward Mandell House, chief advisor to President Wilson, exerted an extremely heavy hand on 3 policy areas that America is still suffering from today. 1, the establishment of a federal income tax. 2, the establishment of the Federal Reserve System. 3, our entry into the League of Nations, a precursor to the United Nations. 2 of the main financial contributors to the CFR were the Carnegie and Rockefeller Foundations. The same name is very important to remember, as you'll see. The CFR became such an important force in American politics that ever since the early 1940s, virtually every candidate for president has been a member. The CFR's primary goals are to establish a single government with global power, 2, eliminate national boundaries, 3, increase the United Nations domain. To support this point, Rear Admiral Chester Ward, former judge advocate of the Navy, from 1956 to 1960, commented, the purpose of promoting disarmament and submergence of U.S. sovereignty and national independence into an all-powerful and one-world government is the only objective revealed to about 95% of the 1,551 members in 1975, end quote. The Wall Street Journal stated in its notable and quotable section on April 10, 1991, in the post-war years, the Council on Foreign Relations has continued to represent an invaluable way for many Washingtonians to tap the enormously important New York business and intellectual community, end quote. What does that mean? The answer is very important because the supposed elected leaders that we place in Washington, D.C. don't make the decisions that affect our lives. Rather, the real shots are called in New York City and even Europe. Thus, the direction our government takes isn't determined in the halls of Congress or the Oval Office, but instead in New York City by international bankers and the heads of multinational businesses. This, I'm sorry to say, is the key to power in our country. Filling an administration's cabinet with CFR members is startling, as the numbers below reveal. Nixon, 115 CFR members. Carter, 284 CFR members. Reagan, 257 CFR members. Bush, 382 CFR members. Clinton, 17 of his top 19 cabinet members were either CFR or Trilateral Commission. The third group, the Trilateral Commission, was formed in 1973 by Zbigniew Brzezinski and David Rockefeller, and is at the top of the financial brotherhood. Regrettably, the executive branch is below them. A description of this group is provided by Anthony C. Sutton and Patrick M. Wood in Trilaterals over Washington. 1. The Trilateral Commission was formed primarily by David Rockefeller. 2. Its members are chosen by David Rockefeller and for assistance. 3. They're financed by David Rockefeller and the Kettering and Ford Foundations. State the authors. Without being accused of hastiness or bias, one can reasonably conclude that David Rockefeller is the power behind the Trilateral Commission and presumably stands to gain the most from its activities. The essential point to hold in mind is that a global multinational corporation, Chase Manhattan, owned by David Rockefeller, is in control of a power vehicle that controls the United States government. In 1976, the American voter thought they had elected Jimmy Carter. In fact, they elected Chase Manhattan. Introductory chapter to a book about the trilaterals titled Trilateralism, Managing Dependence and Democracy, an Overview, states, the chief goal of this commission, the people, governments, and economies of all nations must serve the needs of multinational banks and corporations, end quote. How is this information settling with you thus far? Well, don't worry, it gets scarier. Senator Barry Goldwater, in his book No Apologies, called the Trilateral Commission David Rockefeller's newest international cabal. Since I mentioned Brzezinski earlier, a few quotes from him are appropriate to convey where these people are coming from. These are culled from Between Two Ages, which is one of the Trilateral Commission's most important books. Marxism is simultaneously a victory of the external active man over the inner passive man, and a victory of reason over belief. Marxism, disseminated on the popular level in the form of communism, represented a major advance in man's ability to conceptualize his relationship to the world. Marxism supplied the best available insight into contemporary reality. End quote. If I didn't know better, I'd say Zig the Mad Dog actually liked Marxism and communism. And to think he was David Rockefeller's right-hand man and also a key member of Jimmy Carter's cabinet. Something smells fishy to me. Zig's views on how he sees the world are further represented in the technotronic era. The nation state as a fundamental unit of man's organized life has ceased to be the principal creative force. International books and international banks and international corporations are acting and planning in terms that are far in advance of the political concepts of the nation state, end quote. How much obvious could it be? The controllers want to diminish, then virtually eliminate national sovereignty and the Constitution, replacing it with a new framework determined by them, unelected global financial leaders. Is this what you want? Adding fuel to the fire, the Washington Post published a piece in 1976 that said, "Trilateralists are not three-sided people. They are members of a private, though not secret, international organization put together by the wealthy banker David Rockefeller." But here's the unsettling thing about the Trilateral Commission. The president-elect is a member. So is the vice president-elect, Walter Mondale. So are the new secretaries of State, Defense, and Treasury. So is Zbigniew Brzezinski, who is a former trilateral director and Carter's next national security advisor, and also a bunch of others who will make foreign policy for America in the next 4 years. Can't you see? It's the same people over and over again who are calling the shots for us, regardless of who the president is. It's the international bankers on Wall Street and in their New York City offices, and to a lesser extent, the heads of multinational corporations. These men and women aren't Democrats or Republicans, but members of the CFR, Trilateral Commission, and the Bilderbergs. In fact, at a 1974 Bilderberg meeting, 7 of the 18 Americans present, or 39%, were either Rockefellers per se or Rockefeller agents. When you examine these organizations, what do you find? The CFR's former director was who? David Rockefeller, who co-founded the Trilateral Commission? David Rockefeller, and who controls nearly 40% of the American invitees to the most powerful group of all, the Bilderbergs. David Rockefeller. Following is some information. President of the American Research Foundation that was provided to him by Mark Jones in 1992. Just 4 men, through their interlocking directorates on boards of large corporations and major banks, controlled the movement of capital and the creation of debt in America. What position did Mark Jones hold prior to disclosing this information? He was the financial advisor to John D. Rockefeller himself. David Rockefeller and his family cabal. Who is David Rockefeller? For starters, he is a billionaire. The chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, arguably the most influential financial center in the world, one-time director of the CFR, co-founder of the Trilateral Commission, and also a perennial attendee of the highly secretive Bilderberg meetings. A September 7, 1962 Time magazine article described David Rockefeller as the prime mover in banking that controls the course of world economic affairs and history. Those accolades aren't too shabby, but to really understand David Rockefeller, you must first become acquainted with the creator of their family fortune, John D. Rockefeller. In Titan, The Life of John D. Rockefeller, author Ron Chernow says, if he'd lived in the Middle Ages, he'd have been the Pope at Rome. Similarly, in The Rockefellers by Collier and Horowitz, the dynasty's dominance is unmistakable. Among the power elite whose rule stretched from Wall Street to Washington, the Rockefellers were without peer. At the apex of the Rockefeller pyramid is Chase Manhattan Bank, an octopus-like financial network with over 50,000 branches and affiliates worldwide. Worldwide is the operative word, for the Rockefellers' loyalty isn't, by any means, to the United States, but to their global interests. Did you know that the first American banks to open in Moscow and Peking were Chase Manhattan? In addition, Chase Manhattan financed the building of the largest truck factory in history. The only catch is it wasn't erected in America, but along the Kama River in the Soviet Union. Do you remember the Soviet Union, our arch enemy, the evil empire, communism, Stalin, and the Cold War? With the above information in mind, we need to ask ourselves, what do the Rockefellers want? The best answer can be found in Gary Allen's book, The Rockefeller File. Their motive is to use American money and know-how to build up your competitors, while at the same time use every devious strategy you can devise to weaken and impoverish this country. The goal is not to bankrupt the United States, rather it is to reduce our productive might and therefore our standard of living. A case in point is China, who is set to replace the United States as the world's next superpower. Let's examine what's going on with this situation. Who is status as most favored nation? We have. Who is providing all the technological know-how to bring China into the 21st century? We are. Who is giving China all their computer parts? We are. And who continues to engage in unbalanced trade agreements with China where their products flood into our country unabated while ours are subject to tariffs and government regulation? We do. When added to how messed up the NAFTA and GATT agreements are orchestrated by the globalists, you have to scratch your head and wonder what forces would be at work to deliberately undermine our country. Is it us, the American people, doing it, or monsters and snakes lurking behind the scenes? John D. Rockefeller himself, in his autobiography, Reminiscences, reinforced this point when he said, "One of our greatest helpers has been the State Department in Washington. Our ambassadors and ministers and consuls have aided to push our way into new markets to the utmost corners of the world." Do you know how they became a world power? Can you see the behind-the-scenes machinations taking place? China is going to become the next world superpower because they are the largest unexploited economic market in the world. And when this transformation takes place, our importance and status will be lessened as it currently is right now. The United States is a cow being led to a slaughterhouse by the New World Order. But other world affairs are also being affected by the globalist manipulative ways. A perfect example is given by the noted economic historian Dr. Balthus Freihofer. He said, "It's a long familiar Rockefeller practice to build a financial empire on predatory oil deals. We need to look at our war in Afghanistan and the real reasons behind it. One of the keys is the oil lying beneath the Caspian region of Russia. The only problem with getting this buried oil to the existing pipelines is a little country standing between them, Afghanistan. But their bamboozling doesn't stop there. It also directly affects domestic policy, as John F. McManus points out in The Insiders, Architects of the New World Order. McManus says one of the more sinister tactics employed by socialists to gain economic control of the people involves accumulating huge national indebtedness. Paying interest on the debt then gives the government leaders the excuse to impose more and more taxation. Think about it. We pay over $300 billion per year in interest on our national debt. If you divide this sum by all the working people in the country, the total comes to $3,000 per person per year to simply pay the interest alone. Can you see how counterproductive this situation is, both to our country and its citizens, every one of us? What could each of us do with an extra $3,000 per year? We're getting screwed in a big way. Do you know what's even more sickening? In 1976, the largest bank in the United States, Chase Manhattan, which generated huge profits throughout the year, filed their taxes. Guess what percentage of their income they paid in U.S. taxes? 0%. Yes, 0%. Why don't we ever hear about any of this nonsense? Quite simply because the Rockefeller is part of a hidden network that runs the world. Don't believe me? The notorious Bilderbergs met at Vermont's Woodstock Inn years ago. Guess who owned the lodge? Yep, Lawrence Rockefeller. In Williamsburg, Virginia. And who owned that one? You got it, the Rockefeller. shouldn't the media let us in on this terrible little secret? Fat chance. As Peter Boyle so exquisitely relayed in his November 25th, 1978 article in The Nation entitled, "Who Owns the Networks?" He said, Chase Manhattan and the other Rockefeller institutions are among the largest holders of network stock with substantial interests in all three networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC. Borsnin then went on to say that if a particular institution holds at least 5% of a company's stock, they can wield great influence or even outright control. At the time this article was written, Chase Manhattan controlled 14% of CBS stock. Now do you know why we never hear any of these dirty little secrets? If you owned the media, would you expose your dirty dealings? Of course not. And neither does the New World Order. They're no dummies, and they don't plan on changing their tactics now. Chapter 48. Nixon, Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, and Bush, all bought, sold, and controlled. The executive office is the beck and call of the controllers. Hidden forces in New York City and beyond, the Bilderbergs, call the shots in our country, determining not only who gets selected, but also who will be in their administration and what policies they will adopt. John F. Kennedy. To his credit, JFK was the last American president who wasn't totally controlled by the shadow powers. But his administration didn't start that way. In fact, according to Anthony Lucas of the New York Times, 63 of the 82 members of JFK's State Department were chosen from the CFR, Council on Foreign Relations. In Kennedy's cabinet specifically, the Secretary of Treasury, the National Security Advisor, McGeorge Bundy, CIA Director, Assistant Secretary of Defense, and Undersecretary of Defense were also CFR. Furthermore, Secretary of Defense Dean Rusk joined the CFR in 1952 and was also the chairman of a certain foundation. Can you guess which one? Yep, the Rockefeller Foundation. The respected economist John Kenneth Galbraith said it best. Those of us who had worked for the Kennedy election were tolerated in the government, but foreign policy was still with the Council on Foreign Relations people. To illustrate how the president's cabinet was chosen for him before JFK took office, he chose Robert McNamara as his Secretary of Defense. Then, at a gathering of his cabinet members, Kennedy was told that McNamara had just entered the room. Befuddled, Kennedy had to ask which one he was prior to being introduced to McNamara. He didn't even know what he looked like. Luckily, JFK came to his senses and realized the horrors surrounding him. Regrettably, his rebelliousness and decision to break free from the controllers also guaranteed his death. After threatening to break the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter them to the wind, and after vowing to stop the war machine by pulling out of Vietnam, he sealed his fate. But I commend President Kennedy for all he did, especially the guts it took to deliver a speech at Columbia University only days before being killed. Quote, "The high office of president has been used to foment a plot to destroy the Americans' freedom, and before I leave office, I must inform the citizens of this plight," end quote. Editor's note, the authenticity of this statement is still a matter of debate. While some highly noted researchers claim that it is true, others doubt its veracity. Courage and an independent, free-thinking mind. Do you know what that bought him? Death. The controllers said, in essence, don't mess with us, and I assure you that no American president ever did again. They killed the king in broad daylight one afternoon in Dallas, Texas. Not only was the act atrocious, but also symbolic. Those bullets that pierced Kennedy's skull are still speaking loud and clear today. If you don't believe me, listen to this quote given by JFK's brother, Robert. All of us will ultimately be judged on the effort we have contributed to building a new world order. On the surface, it may sound as if RFK was supporting the controllers, but read his words again. We are going to be judged on what we do to help build a new world order. Like his brother, RFK was intent on bucking the system and would probably have won the presidency in 1968. To stop his juggernaut, the controllers put a bullet in his head in the summer of '68 in Los Angeles. That day was the very last that we've ever had any hope for an American presidency free from the influence of the New World Order. Every occupant in the White House since then has been bought and paid for. The situation quickly deteriorated during the Johnson administration. As the Chicago Tribune reported in September 1964, David Rockefeller, president of Chase Manhattan Bank, briefed President Johnson today on his recent meeting with Premier Nikita Khrushchev of Russia. It seems Rockefeller and Nikita talked about trade and credit, but the big question is, since when do bank presidents meet with foreign heads of state to talk about high finance, then report back to the President of the United States? Doesn't this scenario seem a little weird? Richard Nixon. In 1946, Richard Nixon was a small-town California lawyer who had never held public office. He was then chosen to run for Congress and won after receiving money from certain forces in New York City. By 1947, 1 year later, he wrote a bill for the United Nations to have the ability to enact, interpret, and enforce world law. By 1952, only 6 years after being a nobody lawyer in Southern California, Nixon was Vice President of the United States. You may wonder how this shady, somewhat unlikable person could have had such a meteoric rise to prominence. The answer lies with a man named Prescott Bush. Bush. Why does that name ring a bell? I guess because President Prescott was George Sr.'s father. Prescott Bush was Dwight Eisenhower's favorite golf partner, and the man who was not only responsible for getting Nixon into politics, but also for securing Tricky Dick's slot as the vice president. 8 years later, Nixon ran for president against John Kennedy. As he was drawing up his platform at the Republican convention, he was suddenly called away to Chicago to meet with someone at their apartment to work out a few details. Who was this individual? Mr. Nelson Rockefeller himself. Why would Nixon do such a thing? He already had the nomination sewed up. Why would he meet with the governor of New York while he was a presidential nominee right in the middle of the Republican convention? It's so strange that Senator Barry Goldwater described it as Grant surrendering to Lee. Nonetheless, Nixon lost to JFK in 1960, then lost a gubernatorial race in California to Pat Brown in 1962. Dejected and seemingly washed up, the candidate walked away, uttering his famous line, "You won't have Richard Nixon to kick around anymore," end quote. To save his career, Tricky Dick realized he needed something to spice up his portfolio. So, in the early 1960s, he joined an influential group. Yes, the nasty old CFR. Still down on his luck, Nixon proceeded to pay a visit to someone in New York City. Guess who? Mr. David Rockefeller. Shortly thereafter, Nixon had not only moved to the Big Apple, but became a member of Nelson Rockefeller's law firm, and also lived in an apartment building owned by Rockefeller. Nelson ended up becoming Nixon's employer, benefactor, landlord, and neighbor. He also worked for a man named John Mitchell, later to be part of his cabinet, who was the personal lawyer for a certain individual. Yep, Nelson Rockefeller. I'm not sure, but doesn't it seem as if the Rockefeller family was exerting an inordinate amount of influence on poor old Tricky Dick? Amazingly, the washed-up Nixon reemerged and was running for president again in both 1968 against Hubert Humphrey. And guess what organization both candidates belonged to? The CFR. To the 1972 election, both Nixon and McGovern were CFR members. As George Wallace said, there's not a dime's worth of difference between the Democrat and Republican parties. How true. Nixon, of course, won the election in '68, and Pat Robertson relays an interesting story about this time period in his book, New World Order. The tale is told by former Secretary of the Navy, William Mittendorf, who served as Nixon's finance chairman in 1968. Mittendorf said the morning after Nixon won the election at 5:30 a.m., two people entered his hotel room to choose his cabinet. One of them was William Rogers, and the other, Nelson Rockefeller. Nixon's Commerce Secretary, Federal Reserve Board Chairman, HEW Secretary, Housing Secretary, UN Ambassador, and many others were all members of one distinct group, the CFR. Treasury Secretary on two different occasions to the same person who twice turned it down. Guess who that person was? David Rockefeller. Spiro Agnew was also selected as Nixon's vice president. Before he was nominated, Agnew had been the national chairman for a certain candidate's presidential campaign in 1968. Who was that candidate? Nelson Rockefeller. But the most blatantly nasty selection for his cabinet was Henry Kissinger. Let's take a moment and examine this man a little more closely. For starters, Nixon only met Kissinger one time prior to granting him the highly important position of Director of National Security, and that was at a casual dinner party. But, you see, Kissinger brought some clout to the table, for he was the 5-year personal advisor on foreign affairs for a very prominent man. Who is that man? You guessed it, Nelson Rockefeller. Thus, it was Mr. Rockefeller who urged Nixon to appoint him. As author J. Robert Muskin discloses, it was principally because of his long association with the Rockefellers that Henry Kissinger became a force in the council. His influence is indirect and enormous, much of it through his Rockefeller connection. On November 1st, 1971, U.S. News and World Report stated, "It was on the advice of Governor Rockefeller, who described Mr. Kissinger as the smartest guy available, that Mr. Nixon chose him for his top advisor on foreign policy." In fact, after he was selected to fill this, Rockefellers gave Kissinger a $50,000 check as a gift to cover his moving expenses to Washington, D.C. What a nice bunch of guys, huh? Finally, according to Associated Press writer Deb Reichman, February 11, 2002, just before he left government, Kissinger had all the phone records moved from his office at the State Department. Guess where he moved them? To a vault at David Rockefeller's estate in New York. But that's not the end. During the first year of his presidency, Nixon came up with a program called his New Federalism. Where did he get this title? From a book written by someone close to him? Who is that someone? Nelson Rockefeller. Now, where do you think Nelson Rockefeller's head was at this time? In an October 1975 interview with Playboy magazine, he said, "I'm a great believer in planning. Economic, social, political, military, total world planning." World planning, and the Rockefeller that has anything to do with the New World Order, or is it just a coincidence? The amount of control by outside forces was so extreme that Mike Colbert wrote an article in the Richmond, California Independent Gazette on June 27, 1974, in reference to his discussions with Charles Colson, a member of Nixon's cabinet. Stated Colbert, "This is a de facto secret government operating nationally and internationally, and involved in the highest circles of the U.S. government, exercising an impact over domestic policies and economics, ranging between extreme influence to, at times, outright control. This extreme influence to outright control naturally includes the presidency. The de facto secret government, much of whose intellectual and financial muscle are to be found in the New York office of the CFR, the great tax-free foundation, and certain international firms and corporations. End quote. As we all know, the Nixon administration melted down and he was bounced from office. Things could have gone better, but his successor, Gerald Ford, a member of the totally corrupt Warren Commission, attended 2 top secretive meetings prior to being anointed president. What type of meetings were they? You guessed it, Bilderberg meetings. But that's not the worst part of this scam job. Do you remember whom Ford chose as his vice president? Good old Nelson Rockefeller. If Sarah Jane Moore or Lynette Squeaky Fromm on 2 different occasions had known how to shoot their guns, we would have had a Rockefeller in the White House. Scary, huh? Jimmy Carter's phenomenal rise to public office, we must first has much of its personal investment property in Atlanta, Georgia. Answer: the Rockefellers. Their influence in this city, home of Ted Turner's AOL, Time Warner, mind control brainwashing, psychic driving CNN TV network, is so vast that David Horowitz, in his book The Rockefellers, said Atlanta is Rockefeller Center South. In 1961, David Rockefeller invited the virtually unknown Jimmy Carter to eat with him at Chase Manhattan Bank in New York City. The year before, in 1970, he was transformed from a simple peanut farmer into being the governor of Georgia. Their interaction continued in 1973. Lawrence Stern, reporting in the Washington Post on May 8, 1976, said that Jimmy Carter met with 2 individuals in London and was told that he would be given the go-ahead to win the presidency. Who were those 2 individuals? One was Lord Rothschild, and the other was David Rockefeller. This story is corroborated by a 1973 London Times article that said, while in London during the autumn of 1973, Carter met with another visitor who was forming an international commission and wanted someone to fill the slot of presidency in the White House. The commission they formed was a trilateral commission, of course. And the person Carter met with? David Rockefeller. Now, do you think there are no behind-the-scene interventions by very powerful and secretive men? Carter met with the Rothschilds and Rockefellers. But David Rockefeller wasn't the only man to take Carter under his wing. There was also the mad dog Zbigniew Brzezinski. On May 23, 1976, New York Times reporter Leslie H. Gelb wrote, Brzezinski was the first guy in the community to pay attention to Carter, to take him seriously. He spent time with Carter, sent him books and articles, educated him. In other words, Brzezinski became his mentor, making and molding this virtual unknown, then selecting him as the president. 16 years later, they did the same thing with another relative unknown, Bill Clinton. They have much more influence than we do in regard to whom will occupy the White House. In fact, in 1973, 3 years before the election, Zig decided that the winner of the next election needed the Democratic candidate in 1976 will have to emphasize work, the family, religion, and increasingly patriotism. My question is, why is he deciding anything for us, let alone what our president needs in order to win? The Far Eastern Economic Review, quoted by Howard Zinn in his book, A People's History of the United States, confirms this point. He writes, Peter Bourne, Carter's former deputy campaign chief, has said David Rockefeller and Zbig Brzezinski had both agreed that Carter was the ideal politician to build on. I don't know about you, doesn't this arrangement seem pretty twisted? Since when do David Rockefeller and Neo Brzezinski decide who the ideal president will be? Shouldn't we do that? Worse, after they chose him, he ends up winning, too. The manipulations keep going. In 1973, David Rockefeller and Zbig formed the Trilateral Commission. These men wanted a trilateral in the Oval Office in '76, so they went through a list of all the liberal Democrats and decided who would be the best fit for the suit. Zbig was quoted as saying at the time, "It was a close thing between Carter and Askew, Florida governor, but we were impressed that Carter had opened up trade offices for the state of Georgia in Brussels and Tokyo." That seemed to fit perfectly into the concept of the trilaterals. Again, making these decisions, especially ones that are furthering their global interests. Worse, after he helps decide who will be president and what policies are implemented, he then becomes part of the cabinet. Senator Barry Goldwater, a man definitely in the know, describes the situation. David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski found Jimmy Carter to be their ideal candidate. They helped him win the nomination. To accomplish this purpose, they mobilized the money power of Wall Street, the intellectual influence of the academic community, which is subservient to the wealth of the great tax-free foundations, and the media controllers represented in the membership of the Council of Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission. Ladies and gentlemen, Barry Goldwater isn't any run-of-the-mill Joe Sixpack sitting on a bar stool spouting off about this. He was one of the most knowledgeable senators we've ever. In the above paragraph, he essentially outlined how the 1976 presidential election was rigged by forces hiding behind a cloak of secrecy. A big question now is, what part did Jimmy Carter play in this scenario? Was he fully aware of the machinations taking place behind the scenes? Instead of giving a direct answer, we'll let this drama unfold on its own. To get the ball rolling, let's begin with a speech Carter gave in Boston on February 17, 1976, 9 months before the election. This country know from bitter experience that we are not going to get these changes merely by shifting around the same group of insiders. The insiders had their chance and they have not delivered, end quote. I agree, so far so good. A couple of weeks before winning the election, Hamilton Jordan, one of Jimmy Carter's aides, said, "If after the inauguration you find a Cy Vance as Secretary of State and Zbigniew Brzezinski as head of national security, then I would say we failed, and I would quit. But that's not going to happen. You're going to see new faces and new ideas," end quote. But guess what? Cy Vance did become Secretary of State. But before doing so, he was chairman of the board of a very famous foundation. Can you guess which one? Yeah, the Rockefeller Foundation. And Zbig did become head of national security. And can you guess what organization he belonged to? The CFR. Zbig is also co-founder of the Trilateral Commission with, you guessed it, David Rockefeller. Things are really starting to look bad now, especially when we consider the head of CFR during Carter's administration was David Rockefeller. Also, Carter's vice president, Walter Mondale, was CFR, as were those who filled his 3 top posts. Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance. Secretary of Defense, Harold Brown. Secretary of the Treasury, Michael Blumenthal. director was CFR, as were the Secretary of HEW, HUD, his National Security Advisor, and the Ambassador to the UN. In all, and listen closely, the top 19 positions in Carter's cabinet were held by Trilateral Commission members. These are all extremely powerful posts and constitute nearly 1/3 of the total United States membership in the Trilateral Commission. Think about how scary that is. 1 out of every 3 people in Jimmy Carter's cabinet belonged to the Trilateral Commission. Why didn't he just fess up and call his administration the CFR-TC? It would have been more accurate. Add that to the fact that every single person that was instrumental in constructing Carter's foreign policy was a previous member of the Trilateral Commission. Not 10% or 50%, but 100%. Volcker, chairman of the Federal Reserve, was a former employee of a famous bank. Guess which one? David Rockefeller's Chase Manhattan. This administration was so infiltrated and corrupted by outside forces. On the July 1977 cover of the Atlantic Monthly is a cartoon picture of Jimmy Carter and David Rockefeller in a wooden tub with the headline reading, "Carter revealed he's a Rockefeller Republican." Finally starting to see the full picture? In his book, New World Order, Pat Robertson tells the following story. Lou Sheldon was a pro-family advocate and friend of Jimmy Carter. Prior to Carter winning the election, these two discussed what type of people they would like in Carter's cabinet. Sheldon arrived at the Carter residence to find the next president barefoot and in blue jeans. They greeted each other warmly, and Sheldon proudly presented the booklet with a roster of names and resumes of persons who wanted in their cabinet. Carter took it, read it, and began to cry. When he got back to Virginia Beach, Sheldon said Jimmy was so touched by all the work we did that tears came to his eyes. I said, "Lou, you are wrong. The reason he cried is because the appointment process is out of his hands, and he isn't going to appoint any of his own people." End quote. Not one person Jimmy Carter wanted in his cabinet was appointed, not one. They were all selected for him. Are you starting to get a sick feeling in your stomach? Ronald Reagan. After Ronald Reagan beat Jimmy Carter in the 1980 election, you would think there couldn't be two more opposite candidates. Carter was a liberal Southern Democrat and Reagan a Hollywood conservative Republican. Surely the same people who infiltrated Carter's cabinet would never be able to do the same thing with old Ronald Reagan. Case. In 1980, 2 months before the November election, a party was thrown for Reagan in Middlesburg, Virginia. Reagan sat in the seat of honor, of course, and beside him, to his right, sat a very important man. Guess who that person was? David Rockefeller, head of the CFR and Trilateral Commission. Somewhere along the line, Reagan was told that his bid for the presidency on the Republican ticket would be thwarted unless he chose George Bush as his vice president. He did so and soon was bombarded by heaps of money by, guess who? David Rockefeller. Ironically, a few months after being inaugurated, Reagan was nearly assassinated by John Hinckley Jr. Who do you think was very close friends with the Hinckley family, even dining with them shortly before the assassination attempt? George Bush himself. Coincidence? You decide, especially in light of the fact that Nelson Rockefeller came within a breath of being the president if Squeaky Fromme had known how to shoot a gun. Though he claimed to not be an insider, Reagan's cabinet was packed with CFR, or trilateral, members, including his campaign manager, CIA director, chief of staff, and secretaries of state, treasury, commerce, and defense. It appears the lyrics changed, but the music was still the same. George Herbert Walker Bush, the ultimate insider. Here is George H.W. Bush's biography. 1948, graduated from Yale, where he was a member of Skull and Bones, the most notorious collegiate secret society in existence, and breeding ground for future CFR and CIA members. Note, Bush would later be on the CFR's board of directors and also member of the Trilateral Commission. November 29, 6 days after JFK was assassinated, J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, sent a memo to State Department saying the Texas Special Agent W.T. Forsyth briefed Mr. George Bush of the Central Intelligence Agency about problems with the JFK assassination. Following is a quote from Chris Milligan's article, Everything You Ever Wanted to Know But Were Afraid to Ask, that appeared in Periscope. Many researchers contend that George Bush has been with the CIA since the early 1950s, and that one of his jobs was to consolidate and coordinate the worldwide narcotics industry, the largest industry on earth. Some say that one of the reasons behind the Vietnam police action cover for the consolidation of the Golden Triangle. 1967 to 70, Texas congressman, 2 terms. 1971 to 73, U.S. ambassador during the Nixon administration. 1973 to 74, national chairman of the Republican Party. 1974 and 75, U.S. liaison to China under President Ford, board of directors on the Atlantic Council of the United States. 1975, CIA director. 1979, according to plan, the following year he would make his first run for president. Bush stepped down from both the CFR and Trilateral Commission. Concerning this move, David Rockefeller told Sidney Blumenthal of the Washington Post on February 10, 1988, even though he has resigned, he hasn't walked away from them. In fact, on March 19, 1981, less than 2 months after entering the office of vice president, Elder Bush spoke before the Trilateral Commission in Washington, D.C. Also, the next day he was supposed to confer with them again in the White House, but that's the day Reagan was shot. 1980, when Bush Sr. ran against Ronald Reagan in the Republican primaries, he received the highest contributions allowed by law from the following people: David Rockefeller, Edwin Rockefeller, Helen Rockefeller, Lawrence Rockefeller, Mary Rockefeller, Godfrey Rockefeller, and a number of other Rockefeller relatives and employees. 1981, Vice President of the United States. 1988, elected as President of the U.S. by defeating Michael Dukakis. 1989, guess who was listed as a new member in the CFR's annual report? Michael Dukakis. George H.W. Bush's cabinet, all CFR members. Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney. Secretary of the Treasury, Nicholas Brady. National Security Advisor, Brent Scowcroft. Attorney General, Dick Thornburgh. CIA Director, William Webster. Federal Reserve Chairman, Alan Greenspan. Joint Chief of Staff, Colin Powell. Do any of these names sound familiar? Like maybe these people are part of the current administration? September 1989, Boris Yeltsin journeyed to America and visited 2 people. Whom was the second person he met? Answer, President H.W. Bush at the White House. But whom was the first person he met? David, New York City, at the CFR headquarters. Bill Clinton. Before discussing the specifics of Bill Clinton's career, we need to know that his home state of Arkansas has long been known to be the stronghold of a prominent family for many years. In fact, one member of this famous family was not only elected governor of Arkansas in 1967, but was also the first person to notice Bill Clinton and take him under his wing. The individual in question Winthrop Rockefeller. It seems like that name keeps popping up over and over and over again. After graduating from high school, Bill Clinton took an internship under Arkansas Senator J. William Fulbright, who was a U.S. Senator for 32 years. He also sponsored the Fulbright Act of 1946, which was responsible for sending American students overseas to study. In fact, Fulbright was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, a stanch advocate of the United Nations, a strong internationalist, another name for a globalist. After high school, Clinton attended college at Georgetown, where the noted Illuminati insider professional Carol J. Quigley, author of the premier CFR book, Tragedy and Hope, mentored him. Clinton's training continued with a Rhodes Scholarship at England's Oxford University, which is home for the Round Table and the #1 training ground for New World Order recruits. He then received his law degree from Yale, home of Skull and Bones, and the Bush family's favorite school. Clinton returned to Arkansas, which, as I said earlier, was ruled for years by the Rockefeller banking family. At age 29, an amazingly young age, he became the state's Attorney General. Shortly thereafter, he rose to become the governor and then joined an infamous organization in 1988. Which group could it be? Of course, the Trilateral Commission. Then, in 1989, he became a member of yet another group. Can you guess which one it was? You got it. Are you noticing a theme or a continuous thread that keeps running through each successive administration? Finally, in 1991, Clinton was secretly invited to the creme de la creme meeting of them all, the Bilderberg meeting, in Baden-Baden, Germany. There, it was decided that he would become the next Democratic nominee for president. Regrettably, Clinton won the 1992 election, and during his first inaugural speech, he mentioned and thanked only one person by name. Do you know who that was? Dr. Carol Quigley, one of the premier insiders of all time and noted CFR authority. So Clinton entered the Oval Office, and soon his cabinet was loaded with CFR, Trilateral Commission, and Bilderberg members, including his National Security Advisor, Vice President, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, CIA Director, Treasury Secretary, Chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, Secretary of the Interior, and HUD Secretary. Is everything finally clear? The same people, the CFR, TC, and Bilderberg members keep running the American presidency regardless of whom they select. The same applies to our current president, George W. Bush, and if you don't believe me, leaf back and take a look at the people in his father's cabinet. They're practically identical to who now fills those seats. Every one of them is bought, sold, and controlled. 9. An overview of Gerald Carroll's Project Seek, Onassis, Kennedy, and the Gemstone Thesis. During the 1970s, a document called the Gemstone Papers was circulated throughout the underground. The author, Bruce Roberts, encouraged his readers to pass this thesis along however possible. The only way to spread this information here in America is hand-to-hand. Make 1, 5, 10, 100 copies, or whatever you can, and give them to friends, polls, or media groups. The game is nearly up. Either the mafia goes or America goes, end quote. The Gemstone Thesis contends the following. During the early 1900s, Aristotle Onassis and Joseph Kennedy became extremely wealthy men. Onassis from cornering the shipping lanes and running opium, and Kennedy from bootlegging whiskey during Prohibition. Along the way, these men joined forces to further each other's career. In the 1950s, Onassis cohorts kidnapped Howard Hughes and replaced him with a double, then assumed control of his empire, which was built on defense and aviation industries. Onassis, via his mob connections, was instrumental in giving John F. Kennedy the presidency in 1960. Indebted to Onassis, John Kennedy and his brother Robert, nonetheless, double-crossed the kingpin and his mafia counterparts after Joe Sr. suffered a heart attack in 1961. Onassis retaliated by destroying Camelot. Do you remember that famous assassination? Then ran off with Jackie O. Gerald Ford and the Warren Commission covered up the entire affair by naming Lee Harvey Oswald as the lone killer, or Patsy. Robert and Teddy Kennedy were well aware of these circumstances, so the former was also hit while the latter's political career was destroyed at Chappaquiddick. The Gemstone File, a sordid expose of these shenanigans, fell into Richard Nixon's hands. Paranoid about his long-standing mob connections, he soon became entangled in the Watergate debacle and was brought down by Katharine Graham of the Washington Post. With Tricky Dick out of the picture, Gerald Ford was rewarded for his services by being given the non-elected position of President of the United States of America. This tale concludes with Hustler magazine's Larry Flynt. The illustrious porn king became interested in the Gemstone Files during the mid-1970s and offered $1 million to anyone that could reveal the truth behind the Kennedy assassination. Prior to releasing the Gemstone Files to a national audience in Hustler magazine, Flynt was crippled by a gunman's bullets. Months later, a censored version of the Gemstone document was released. With this timeline in mind, I'd like to expand upon the particulars. Before doing so, I'll begin with an introduction to the Gemstone Files that appeared in the February 1979 edition of Hustler magazine, written by editor John Clancy. Throughout history, whenever new voices become powerful and commanding, there is a traceable pattern of violent response. Whether from the right or left, there is a stealthy, savage reaction, like a shaft of ramrod steel. From Jesus Christ to Chile's Salvador Allende, the markings are clear. Action calls forth reaction, and nowhere is this more clear than in the savage history of our own country. Abraham Lincoln, Huey Long, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and all others whose cries for justice have been stilled by the staccato burst of a gun. These are the facts of our political life. Sudden death is not just an overtime in professional football. The article that follows the Gemstone File, a condensation of a 1,000-page manuscript, may be considered by many to be a work of madness. But remember, through all the ages, all innovative works of genius have been thought to be the products of insanity. One need only reflect on the spectacle of Galileo recanting before the church. It was madness, they said, for him to advance the notion that the earth moved around the sun. And they were right, it was madness, even though he was correct. The astronomer's thinking was madness because it upset the settled scheme of things and could be could be proven for all to see. For that reason, Galileo's idea had to be dismissed and done away with, perhaps just like the Gemstone File. No doubt reasonable men will say the factual essentials of the Gemstone File are simply preposterous because they go too far and encompass too much. That may be true, but it should never be overlooked that the hellish vision this article contains may well bear the germs of truth, virulent though they may be. Aristotle, Onassis, Joseph Kennedy, and John D. Rockefeller. One of the Gemstone Files' main contentions was that Aristotle Onassis was the crowned head of the mafia. It also states that Ari made his fortune by transporting opium, especially after the United States outlawed it in the early part of the 20th century, causing prices to increase tenfold. Being an extremely profitable venture, Airy made a killing by transporting drugs, then focused his attention on the oil business by joining forces with John D. Rockefeller. The Gemstone File claims that in 1934 these two titans reached an agreement where Rockefeller would refine the oil while Aristotle shipped it. Airy knew that whoever ruled the shipping lanes would become inordinately wealthy, for not only would he control the oil market, but drugs, arms, and war supplies. John D. Rockefeller, on the other hand, had an interest in recapturing the oil industry after the government forced him to break up his monopoly of Standard Oil in the early 1900s. While embarking upon these pursuits, Airy was also involved with another historical figure, Joseph Kennedy. Old Man Kennedy, of course, made his fortune by being a bootlegger during Prohibition. Being that booze was illegal in this country, Kennedy struck up a deal where Airy and Mr. Onassis would ship the contraband into Boston, then Joe Sr. would sell it. Having a long-term association with the mob, Joe Kennedy felt right at home dealing with Airy. To show his gratitude, in 1937, Joe Kennedy, while chairman of the United States Maritime Commission, sold a fleet of surplus ships to Aristotle. With these ships, Onassis would build his empire. Joe Kennedy's decision to sell these ships to Airy was quite controversial, being that the world was quickly barreling toward World War II. But war was exactly what Airy, Joe, John D., the Roosevelts, and I.G. Farben wanted. What better way was there to make a quick buck than selling oil, arms, and drugs to both the Axis and Allied forces? And don't forget how much dough John D. and Kennedy made off the stock market crash. See, this is how our fine country was destroyed in 1913. While we're on the subject of World War II, here's a final side note. The notorious I.G. Farben, manufacturer of Zyklon B gases used in Nazi death camps, was also the largest heroin producer in Germany between World War I and World War II. A nice bunch of guys. Huh? Howard Hughes. The story associated with Howard Hughes is a rather brief but vitally important key to this story. You see, Hughes may have become the wealthiest man in the shortest amount of time during the 20th century. By cornering the aviation and defense industries, he literally came into money hands over fist. If you think about the top dollars paid to the likes of Northrop, McDonnell Douglas, Hughes, etc., you'll understand where his wealth originated. Plus, Hughes was smart enough to get past America's tax laws by setting up the tax-free Hughes Foundation. Hating the concept of taxes and seeing what a cash cow Hughes was sitting on, Aristotle Onassis decided to kidnap Hughes in 1957 and replace him with a double. That same year, Onassis took final control of the mob, then ran the Hughes empire as another arm of his growing illegal operation. Hughes, on the other hand, became a secluded heroin addict who finally died in 1971. Kennedys. As mentioned in the timeline, Joe Kennedy Sr. and Aristotle Onassis became business partners in the early 1900s, each of them furthering the other's career. During Prohibition, when obtaining alcohol was difficult, Mr. Onassis transported huge shipments of booze into Boston for Kennedy to sell illegally. In return, Joe Kennedy laid the foundation for Onassis' empire by selling him a fleet of U.S. surplus ships while he was chairman of the U.S. Maritime Commission in 1937. This single act made it possible for Airy O to become one of the single wealthiest men on the planet. In return, Onassis promised that the two men would continue helping each other and that someday a Kennedy would be put in the White House. To begin this section, let's set the stage with the following scene. The year is 1957. Dwight Eisenhower is president and JFK is a New England congressman with a promising future. 3 years before the next presidential election, Joe Kennedy Sr. took his son John onto Ari O's yacht for a little discussion, reminding Ari of his promise. Someday a Kennedy would be in the White House. Onassis felt very confident about this election and that he owned both candidates. You see, Richard Nixon, who would be the Republican nominee, was bought and paid for years earlier by Howard Hughes, who had recently been kidnapped by Onassis. Nixon had countless dues to be paid because of his mob connections and was already in the bag. JFK, on the other hand, was well aware of his old man's ties to not only Ari, but also his history of mob-related dealings during Prohibition. If you doubt this analysis, ask yourself how John Kennedy could have possibly had a tumultuous affair with Judith Exner, who was girlfriend of Sam Giancana, quite possibly the most notorious mobster in the country at that time. People don't just have flings with mob girlfriends out of the blue. There has to be some sort of connection. In the end, we know it's true because without the mob pulling Chicago for Kennedy in the 1960 election, he would never have defeated Nixon. Now, here's where things get sticky. In 1961, Joe suffered a stroke and slipped out of the picture. JFK and Bobby were, in essence, free, now able to call their own shots. They knew what kind of men their father ran around with, and they were well aware of his deal with Ari. In all honesty, they could have been on the cusp of a true Kennedy presidential dynasty. First, John would serve until 1968, then Bobby from 69 to 76, and finally Teddy from 77 to 84. The Kennedys could have conceivably held the Oval Office for 24 years. But what do John and Bobby start doing? They welch on the agreement Joe made with Ari and started going after organized crime. I'm sure all of us have seen the infamous newsreels where Jimmy Hoffa is sitting before the Senate and Bobby Kennedy is grilling him. But instead of letting well enough alone, the Gemstone file contends the Kennedys double-crossed Ari and began the most extreme family bloodbath in U.S. history. Why would the Kennedy brothers commit what was essentially political suicide? It's difficult to gauge their motivation, but on the surface, it almost appears to be a case of idealism run rampant. I mean, here are the Kennedy boys. JFK is president, and his younger brother, Bobby, is attorney general. The old man is now incapacitated and no longer pulling their strings, yet they have all these mobsters, teamsters, crooked politicians, corrupt billionaires, and creeps like CIA and J. Edgar Hoover to deal with. Plus, the media created a Camelot setting for them. Jack could get laid anytime he wanted with any woman he desired, even Marilyn Monroe, and the public by and large adored this youthful, handsome, entertaining president. If he bucked the system and went after the mob, what could possibly happen? He was the president, after all, indestructible, invincible, and untouchable. Ari O didn't buy into this rationale for 1 second. He got double-crossed and didn't like seeing this good guy, bad guy scenario being played out by two rich kids from Massachusetts. So, being that Kennedy boys welched on their agreement, Ari put a hit on them. Considering how many others were infuriated by John's actions, it didn't take long to find a multitude of recruits to help pull off the killing of a king. The first black mark against Kennedy came with the Bay of Pigs fiasco. Not only did Kennedy blow it, then blame the debacle on the CIA, who he later said would be broken into 1,000 pieces and scattered to the wind, but the mob and Ari O were losing tons of money ever since Castro took over Cuba and shut down the casinos. In those days, Cuba was a terrific playground popularized by Ernest Hemingway, attracting scores of wealthy tourists that boozed and gambled and spent their dough freely. Once Castro shut down this market, many people felt the pinch. In all likelihood, I don't think the Kennedy brothers knew what they were dealing with at this point. Sure, they were trying to clean up the system and get rid of the crooks, but when you start going after the mob and CIA, idealism doesn't get you very far. On the other hand, Arie, a longtime drug dealer, was extremely street smart and realized there was supposed to be honor among thieves and a criminal code, where you stuck to your deals and didn't screw over certain people. What made things worse was that Arie was the one who put JFK into office over Nixon, and now Kennedy blew the Bay of Pigs. Tricky Dick would have surely carried out their plans in Cuba and given the gambling and booze profits back to the big boys. So now we've reached the end of year 1963, and plans were set in motion to knock off Kennedy. But what were the reasons? Why kill a sitting president? 1. Kennedy undoubtedly wanted to get the United States out of Vietnam, a situation he inherited from Dwight Eisenhower. The first question people should ask is, why were we even in Vietnam? What made that tiny country so important? Did we really need to stop the spread of communism so badly that we'd sacrifice 57,000 American lives plus shatter countless others? Well, the real reason we were in Vietnam had little to do with communism. What certain people actually wanted to do was corner or take control of the Golden Triangle so that they could monopolize the opium fields and resultant heroin trade. The drug trade came so vitally important that heroin was even being shipped back to America in the coffins of our dead GIs. Vietnam was also crucially important to the war machine and the immense amount of money that could be derived from it. It all reverts back to the standard tricks of the trade: illegal drugs, running guns, and control through fear and violence. Clean up and convict the mob. 3. Drastically lessen the CIA's influence. Don't forget, this was an agency that was established less than 2 decades earlier by heavy hitters like Alan Dulles and all the Nazi creeps he smuggled into this country via Project Paperclip after World War II. 4. Kennedy's inability to take back Cuba so that the mob could recoup its gambling profits. 5. Finally, the Kennedy administration had plans to investigate the financial dealings of Howard Hughes, which would have been disastrous to Arie, being that they kidnapped and replaced him with a double in 1957. With the above list in mind, it isn't hard to see Arie O's motivation in knocking off the king. After the Kennedys enacted a full-out assault and reneged on their father's deal, Arie counterattacked by bringing Camelot to its knees. Look at the situation in this light. Here was JFK on top of the world. He's a star. He's the president. He's getting women galore and he feels indestructible. Likewise, Arie has become so wealthy and assured of his hold over the cops, the press, the FBI and CIA, plus the legal system, he was convinced that he could kill Kennedy in broad daylight. If he was successful from that day forward, the mob and the United States government would become one and the same. So what we have here are 2 tremendously powerful forces at work and 2 inflated, very confident egos, each at the top of their game. But Arie had one advantage. According to the Gemstone file, in October of 1963, only 1 month before her husband was assassinated, Jackie O spent 2 weeks on Arie's yacht. Think about it. Arie was living the mobster's creed: kill your enemy, then steal his women. Worse, the author contends that not only did Jackie begin an affair with Aristotle, but she also knew that he planned on whacking him. Jackie didn't know the exact time or date, but she was aware of what was going on. Why do you think she exhibited such superhuman calm after such a horrendous event as a public assassination? I mean, her husband's brains were blasted into her lap, and Jackie O was cool as a cucumber. If this all sounds too Incredible, I'd like to relay a story that I read years ago. The tale takes place at Jackie's wedding, and while speaking with an old friend during her bridal dance, one that she hadn't seen in years, the man says, "I can't believe you fell in love and got married so quickly since the last time I saw you." Upon hearing this statement, Jackie leans forward and whispers in the man's ear, "My dear, whoever said that I was in love?" Anyway, as we all know, Kennedy got ambushed and killed in Dallas, and Lee Harvey Oswald became the fall guy, Patsy. What most people aren't aware of was 2 days later, who was in attendance with all the mourners at the Kennedy mansion? None other than Aristotle Onassis. Think about how wild this is. What in God's name was Ari O doing at the Kennedy's house? Why would he be there? Things are starting to get a little fishy. By this time, Mr. Onassis is the crowned head of the mafia, the world's supposedly richest man, a global powerhouse, and he just snagged the president's wife. Plus, he had a sitting president also in his pocket, for soon after the assassination, LBJ was threatened by Ari himself. There is no conspiracy. Oswald was a lone nut assassin. Get it, Lyndon? Ari then reminded him that if he pushed things, there was a good possibility Air Force One would have an accident someday. When LBJ finally died in 1971, some of his final words were, "You know, fellows, it really was a conspiracy." Bobby Kennedy was well aware of what transpired and who killed his brother. Still, being full of piss and vinegar, there were hints made that he would expose the real conspiracy of killers behind his brother's assassination. To silence this problem, Bobby was killed in Los Angeles during his 1968 Democratic primary campaign, a slot he was sure to win. Similar to Lee Harvey Oswald, Sirhan Sirhan was the patsy. Prior to his role in the assassination, Sirhan wrote, "What is a classic example of psychic driving mind control? My determination to eliminate RFK is becoming more of an unshakable obsession. RFK must die. RFK must be killed. RFK must be assassinated. RFK must die. RFK must be killed. RFK must be assassinated. RFK must die. RFK must be killed. RFK must be assassinated." Robert F. Kennedy must be assassinated before June 5, 1968. Robert Kennedy must be assassinated. Seeing what happened to his two older brothers, Teddy Kennedy was terrified and vowed to be obedient to Ari O, even giving him his blessing to marry Jackie. The only problem was Mary Jo Kopechne, a key organizer of RFK's campaign, who stumbled upon too much touchy information and considered exposing it. To keep her in check and to also destroy any possibility Teddy would enter the White House, Chappaquiddick drove a stake through any future presidential hopes for Teddy. What once looked like a six-term Kennedy dynasty in the Oval Office had now petered to nothingness. Nixon, Ford, and Watergate. With the Kennedy boys out of the way and Lyndon Johnson's usefulness depleted, America needed to elect a new president in 1968. Of all the citizens in this country, who is the best person we could come up with? Richard Nixon. Yep, old Tricky Dick himself. So how does Mr. Nixon fit into the gemstone picture? Like all the major players in this scenario, Nixon had mob ties out the kazoo. Where Joe Kennedy was tied to the Prohibition-era gangsters, and according to Bruce Roberts, Gerald Ford's real father had a background in organized crime, Nixon was also connected to the likes of Bebe Rebozo and Carlos Marchella. In essence, then from 1960 to 1976, America's presidency was characterized by very strong organized crime ties. Richard Nixon first entered the gemstone picture in the mid-1940s when Howard Hughes bought his first politician. Nixon, by giving his brother Donald a $200,000 non-repayable loan for the 1946 California congressional race. Nixon's career progressed rapidly as he became Dwight Eisenhower's vice president for 8 years, beginning in 1953. A temporary blow came in 1960, though, when he lost his presidential bid to JFK. 3 years later, naturally, Kennedy was killed, and Gerald Ford would cover up the assassination as head of the Warren Commission. By 1968, Nixon was elected as our esteemed president, and by 1969, he read an early version of the Gemstone Files. Already looking forward to re-election, Nixon realized the powers that be had loads of dirt on him, especially in regard to his mob ties. Fearful this information could be leaked to the Democratic National Committee, the seeds for Watergate were planted. Over time, the controllers came to see Nixon as a loose cannon that had to be eliminated. So what was originally a non-eventful break-in at the Watergate Hotel became President Nixon's downfall. Leading the charge for Nixon's head, at least publicly, was none other than Katharine Graham, who was in charge of the Washington Post. As you'll see later in this book, see Vote Scam, you'll discover Nixon threatened to revoke Graham's FCC license at a television station she owned in Florida due to failure to report on the widespread fraud in Dade County. Former Attorney General Janet Reno, who also played a prominent role in concealing the illegal voting practices. Also, being that Katharine Graham was known as the most powerful woman in America and was a member of both the CFR and Bilderbergs, she was certainly in a position to implement a downfall if the controllers deemed it necessary. Miss Graham became a deep-throat type figure that fed information to Woodward and Bernstein. With the writing on the wall that his crucifixion had been successfully orchestrated, Nixon finally resigned after David Rockefeller sent Henry Kissinger into his office with these final words, "Resign right now." This, of course, occurred at the infamous meeting where Kissinger and Nixon knelt down and prayed together. The wildest part of this entire scenario, according to Bruce Roberts, was that the notorious 18.5 minutes of missing time on the Watergate tapes is of Nixon ranting about those assholes, Robert Onassis and Howard Hughes. Roberts, Onassis, and Howard Hughes. How do you know why this portion of the tape was mysteriously erased? Anyway, Gerald Ford was rewarded for his loyalty and subservience in covering up the Kennedy assassination by being awarded the presidency after Nixon got knocked off his pedestal. By agreeing to not spill the beans, Nixon was granted a full pardon by Mr. Ford. In all, the machine kept rolling without missing a beat. Conclusion. The final piece of this puzzle concerns an unlikely character, Larry Flynt of Hustler fame. It seems Mr. Flynt wasn't actually shot by a right-wing moralist that disagreed with his magazine's content, but was actually brought down because of a reward he offered in January 1978. Flynt said he'd pay $1 million to anyone that could prove there was a conspiracy behind Kennedy's assassination. Flynt already had the Gemstone file in his possession for at least 3 years since his magazine became nationally renowned, and certain forces realized he could make things very uncomfortable for them. To prevent the publication of a very damning expose that had the Gemstone file at its center, Flynt was shot and crippled. In February 1979, Hustler magazine finally ran a Gemstone article, but its version was watered down, sanitized, and heavily censored to not step on any of the wrong toes. The rest is history and business as usual. Chapter 50, an overview of Michael Collins Piper's final judgment, the missing link in the JFK assassination conspiracy. JFK, the atomic bomb, and Israel's war machine. Israel need not apologize for the assassination or destruction of those who seek to destroy it. The first order of business for any country is the protection of its people, end quote. Washington Jewish Week, October 9, 1997. In March 1992, Illinois Representative Paul Finley said in the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs, "It is interesting but not surprising to note, in all the words written and uttered about the Kennedy assassination, Israel's intelligence agency, the Mossad, has never been mentioned," end quote. Considering the Mossad is quite possibly the most ruthless and efficient intelligence agency in the world, it's peculiar they have never been scrutinized in relation to the Kennedy assassination, especially when practically every other entity in the world, short of Elvis impersonators, has been implicated. That all changed in January 1994 with the release of Michael Collins Piper's final judgment. In his book, Piper says, Israel's Mossad was a primary and critical behind-the-scenes player in the conspiracy that ended the life of JFK. Through its own vast resources and international contacts in the intelligence community and in organized crime, Israel had the means, it had the opportunity, and it had the motive to play a major frontline role in the crime of the century. And it did, end quote. Their motive? Israel's much-touted Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, who ruled that country from inception in 1948 until he resigned June 16, 1963, was so enraged at John F. Kennedy for not allowing Israel to become a nuclear power that, Collins asserts, in his final days in office, he commanded the Mossad to become involved in a plot to kill America's president. Ben-Gurion was so convinced that Israel's very survival was in dire jeopardy that in one of his final letters to JFK he said, "Mr. President, my people have the right to exist, and this existence is in danger," end quote. In the days leading up to Ben-Gurion's resignation from office, he and JFK had been involved in an unpublicized, contentious debate over the possibility of Israel getting nuclear capabilities. Their disagreement eventually escalated into a full-fledged war of words that was virtually ignored in the press. Ethan Bronner wrote about his secret battle between JFK and Ben-Gurion years later in a New York Times article on October 31, 1998, calling it a fiercely hidden subject. In fact, the Kennedy-Ben-Gurion conversations were still classified by the United States government. Maybe this is the case because Ben-Gurion's rage and frustration became so intense and his power so great within Israel that Piper contends it was at the center of the conspiracy to kill John Kennedy. The stance is supported by New York banker Abe Feinberg, who describes the situation as such. Ben-Gurion could be vicious, and he had such a hatred of the old man, Joe Kennedy Sr., JFK's father. Ben-Gurion despised Joe Kennedy because he felt not only was he an anti-Semite, but he also sided with Hitler during the 1930s and 40s. We'll touch upon this aspect of the story later in the article. Anyway, Ben-Gurion was convinced that Israel needed nuclear weapons to ensure its survival, while Kennedy was dead set against it. This inability to reach an agreement caused obvious problems. One of them revolved around Kennedy's decision that he would make America his top priority in regard to foreign policy, and not Israel. Kennedy planned to honor the 1950 tripartite declaration, which said the United States would retaliate against any nation in the Middle East that attacked any other country. Ben-Gurion, on the other hand, wanted the Kennedy administration to sell them offensive weapons, particularly Hawk missiles. The two leaders engaged in a brutal letter exchange, but Kennedy wouldn't budge. Ben-Gurion, obsessed by this issue, slipped into total paranoia, feeling that Kennedy's obstinance was a blatant threat to the very existence of Israel as a nation. Piper writes, Ben-Gurion had devoted a lifetime creating a Jewish state and guiding it into the world arena. In Ben-Gurion's eyes, John F. Kennedy was an enemy of the Jewish people and his beloved state of Israel. He continues, the nuclear option was not only at the very core of Ben-Gurion's personal worldview, but the very foundation of Israel's national security policy. Ben-Gurion was so preoccupied with obtaining nuclear weapons that on June 27, 1963, 11 days after resigning from office, he announced, I do not know of any other nation whose neighbors declare that they wish to terminate it, and not only declare, but prepare for it by all means available to them. We must have no illusions that what is declared every day in Cairo, Damascus, and Iraq are just words. This is the thought that guides the Arab leaders. I am confident that science is able to provide us with weapons that will serve the peace and deter our enemies. Avner Cohen in Israel and the Bomb, published by Columbia University Press, reinforces this sense of urgency by writing, imbued with lessons of the Holocaust, Ben-Gurion was consumed by fears of security. Anxiety about the Holocaust reached beyond Ben-Gurion to infuse Israel's military thinking. He further adds fuel to this point by pointing out, Ben-Gurion had no qualms about Israel's need for weapons of mass destruction. And Ben-Gurion's worldview and his decisive governing style shaped his critical role in instigating Israel's nuclear progress, end quote. Kennedy, on the other hand, was adamant in his refusal to promote Israel's ascension to the nuclear stage. Avner Cohen in Israel and the Bomb stresses, no American president was more concerned with the danger of nuclear proliferation than John Fitzgerald Kennedy. He was convinced that the spread of nuclear weapons would make the world more dangerous and undermine U.S. interests. Cohen continues at the end of this passage. The example Kennedy used to make this point was Israel, end quote. Realizing that Kennedy would not change his mind, Ben-Gurion decided to join forces with Communist China. Both countries were greatly interested in creating nuclear programs, and so began their secret joint dealings. Working in unison through intermediary Shaul Eisenberg, who was a partner of Mossad gunrunner and accountant Tibor Rosenbaum, Israel and China proceeded to develop their own nuclear capabilities without the knowledge of the United States. If you find this scenario improbable, I strongly urge you to read Mossad and CSIS, Chinese Secret Service, have conspired. If you find this scenario improbable, I strongly urge you to read Gordon Thomas' excellent book, Seeds of Fire, where he exposes how the Mossad and CSIS have conspired on many occasions to not only steal American military secrets, to also doctor U.S. intelligence programs such as the Justice Department's PROMIS software. The instance, I'm afraid to say, is but the first where echoes of the JFK assassination can still be felt today, reverberating through our post-9/11 world. The danger of Israel developing the bomb in unison with China became a highly volatile situation and was closely monitored by the CIA. Intent on pursuing this path, the Israelis constructed a nuclear facility at Dimona. When Kennedy demanded that the U.S. inspect this plant, Ben-Gurion was so incensed that he erected another phony facility that held no evidence of nuclear research and development. Does this scenario sound eerily familiar to the game we're playing with Saddam Hussein in Iraq right now? Finally aware of their shenanigans, JFK told Charles Bartlett, "Those sons of bitches lie to me constantly about their nuclear capability," end quote. Avner Cohen in Israel and the Bomb reiterates this claim by saying Ben-Gurion had taken the nuclear issue so closely to heart that he concluded he would not tell the truth about Dimona to American leaders, not even in private, end quote. Dr. Gerald M. Steinberg, political science professor at Bar Ilan University's Besa Center for Strategic Studies in Tel Aviv, weighs in by saying, between 1961 and 63, the Kennedy administration placed a great deal of pressure on Ben-Gurion in the effort to pressure for acceptance of international inspection of Dimona and Israeli abdication of their nuclear weapons. This pressure apparently did not alter Israeli policy, but it was a contributing factor to Ben-Gurion's resignation in 1963, end quote. To convey how serious the situation had become in modern terms, look at what is happening in Iraq with United Nations security teams inspecting the royal palaces and bunkers for nuclear weapons and materials. This matter is so urgent that our nation is on the verge of war. 40 years earlier, the heat that JFK was placing on Ben-Gurion was equally as strong as what George Bush is laying on Saddam Hussein today. To convey how serious the situation had become in modern terms, look at what's happening in Iraq with the United Nations security teams inspecting royal palaces and bunkers for nuclear weapons and materials. The matter is so urgent that our nation is on the verge of war. 40 years earlier, the heat that JFK was placing on Ben-Gurion was equally as strong as what George Bush is laying on Saddam Hussein today. In Israel and the Bomb, Avner Cohen reinforces this point. To force Ben-Gurion to accept the conditions, Kennedy exerted the most useful leverage available to an American president in dealing with Israel, a threat that an unsatisfactory solution would jeopardize the U.S. government's commitment to and support of Israel. Pressure on Ben-Gurion was so immense that he ended up leaving office. But Kennedy, in true pit bull style, didn't let up on Ben-Gurion's successor, Levi Eshkol. As Avner Cohen reports, Kennedy told Eshkol that the U.S. commitment and support of Israel could be seriously jeopardized if Israel did not let the U.S. obtain reliable information about its efforts in the nuclear field. Kennedy's demands were unprecedented. They amounted in effect to an ultimatum. Cohen concludes this thought by asserting Kennedy's letter precipitated a near-crisis situation in Eshkol's office. In the end, as we're all aware, Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963. But less known is that China conducted its first nuclear test in October 1964. What makes the event more profound is Piper's claim that even though Israel said its first nuclear test took place in 1979, they actually occurred in October 1964 along with the Chinese. If this is true, other than August 1945 when the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, October 1964 may have possibly been the most dangerous month in the 20th century. Let's return, though, to JFK's assassination and the direct result of it in regard to the Jewish lobby, American foreign policy, and the militarization of Israel. To understand how powerful the Israeli lobby is in this country, Venerable Senator J. William Fulbright told CBS Face the Nation on April 15, 1973, Israel controls the U.S. Senate. The Senate is subservient, much too much. We should be more concerned about U.S. interests rather than doing the bidding of Israel. The great majority of the Senate of the U.S., somewhere around 80%, is completely in support of Israel. Anything Israel wants, Israel gets. This has been demonstrated time and time again and has made foreign policy difficult for our government. End quote. Do you hear what Senator Fulbright said? This isn't a crazy conspiracy theorist or a KKK anti-Semite. It's a much respected U.S. Senator saying that about 80% of the Senate is in Israel's hip pocket. Adding clout to this argument is Representative Paul Findley, who was quoted in the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs on March 1992. During John Kennedy's campaign for the presidency, a group of New York Jews had privately offered to meet his campaign expenses if he would let them set his Middle East policy. He did not agree. As the president, he provided only limited support of Israel, end quote. To understand how important Kennedy's decisions were during his short-lived presidency, we need to look at the issue of campaign finance. Considering how influential the Israeli lobby is in the U.S. Senate, hearkening back to the words of Senator Fulbright, they had to have been enraged when President Kennedy genuinely wanted to cut the knees out from under the current campaign finance methods because it made politicians so reliant upon the huge cash inlays of special interest groups. Regrettably, Kennedy did not have time to implement this program, and to this day our political system is still monopolized by lobbyists from the very same special interest groups. One can only imagine what changes would have occurred in regard to our foreign policy had Kennedy eradicated these vipers and bloodsuckers from the halls of Congress. Tragically, Kennedy's ideas never came to fruition, and his heated battle with Prime Minister Ben-Gurion over whether Israel should be allowed to develop a nuclear program was ultimately lost. The reason why is that Lyndon Baines Johnson, who Kennedy intended to drop from his ticket in 1964 due to his extreme dislike for, had a complete reversal in foreign policy. As you will see, not only did Israel's nuclear program move ahead unchecked, but they also became primary beneficiary of our foreign aid. But this absolute turnaround would not have occurred if Kennedy would not have been assassinated. Up until LBJ became president, Kennedy dealt with the Middle East in a way that most benefited the U.S. His primary goal, and one which would keep the peace the most, was a balance of power in the Middle East so that each and every nation would be secure. This decision adhered to the Tripartite Declaration, which the U.S. signed in 1950. But under the Johnson administration, this fragile balance was overturned, and by 1967, only 4 years after Kennedy's assassination, the U.S. was Israel's main weapons supplier, and our best interests were put well behind those of Israel. As Michael Collins Piper writes, the bottom line is, JFK was adamantly determined to stop Israel from building the nuclear bomb. LBJ simply looked the other way. JFK's death did indeed prove beneficial to Israel's nuclear ambitions, and the evidence proves it, end quote. Reuven Pedatzer, in a review of Avner Cohen's Israel and the Bomb in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz on February 5, 1999, wrote, "The murder of American President John F. Kennedy brought to an abrupt end the massive pressure being applied by the U.S. administration on the government of Israel to discontinue their nuclear program." He continues, Kennedy made it quite clear to the Israeli Prime Minister that he would not, under any circumstances, agree to Israel becoming a nuclear state. Pedatzer concludes, had Kennedy remained alive, it is doubtful whether Israel would today have a nuclear option, and that Ben-Gurion's decision to resign in 1963 was taken to a large extent against the background of tremendous pressure that Kennedy was applying on him concerning the nuclear issue, end quote. If you're not still convinced, how about some members? In Kennedy's last fiscal budget year of 1964, Israeli aid was 40 million. In LBJ's first budget of 1965, it soared to 71 million. And in 1966, more than tripled from 2 years earlier to 130 million. Plus, during Kennedy's administration, almost none of our aid to Israel was military in nature. Instead, it was split equally between development loans and food assistance under the PL 480 program. Yet, in 1965, under the Johnson administration, 20% of our aid to Israel was for the military, while in 1966, 71% was used for war-related materials. Continuing in this same vein, in 1963, the Kennedy administration sold 5 Hawk missiles to Israel as part of an air defense system. In 1965 to 66, LBJ laid 250 tanks on Israel, 48 Skyhawk missiles, attack aircrafts, plus guns and artillery, which were all offensive in nature. If you ever wondered why the Israeli war machine was created, this is it. LBJ was its father. According to Stephen Green in Taking Sides, America's Secret Relations with a Militant Israel, the 92 million in military assistance provided in fiscal year 1966 was greater than the total of all official military aid provided to Israel cumulatively in all the years going back to the foundation of that nation in 1948. Green continues, 70% of all U.S. official assistance to Israel has been military. America has given Israel over $17 billion in military aid since 1946, virtually all of which, over 99%, has been provided since 1965. Can you see what is happening? Within 2 years of JFK's assassination, Israel went from being a weak, outmatched member of the volatile Middle Eastern community that was not allowed to develop nuclear weapons to one that was well on its way to becoming an undeniable military force on the world stage. John Kennedy adamantly put his foot down and refused to allow Israel to develop a nuclear program, while LBJ bent over backwards to facilitate and bolster them. Or, as Seymour Hersh wrote in The Samson Option, by 1968, the president had no intention of doing anything to stop the Israeli bomb. The result of this shift in focus from the Kennedy to Johnson administration is, in my opinion, the primary reason behind our current troubles in the Middle East, which culminated in the 9/11 attacks and our upcoming war with Iraq and beyond. I have a great deal of confidence in this statement, for, as Michael Collins Piper points out, here are the results of John F. Kennedy's assassination. 1. Our foreign and military aid to Israel increased dramatically once LBJ became president. 2. Rather than trying to maintain a balance in the Middle East, Israel suddenly emerged as the dominant force. 3. Since the LBJ administration, Israel has always had weaponry that was superior to any of its direct neighbors. 4. Due to this undeniable and obvious increase in Israel's war machine, a constant struggle has been perpetuated in the Middle East. 5. LBJ also allowed Israel to proceed with its nuclear development, resulting in them becoming the 6th largest nuclear force in the world. 6. Finally, our huge outlays of foreign aid to Israel, approximately $10 billion a year when all is said and done, has created a situation of never-ending attacks and retaliation in the Middle East, plus outright scorn and enmity against the U.S. for playing the role of Israel's military enabler. In Israel's and especially David Ben-Gurion's eyes, what were the alternatives? To remain weakened or at least balanced in relation to their neighbors and handcuffed by JFK's refusal to bow to their will, or kill the one man standing in their way to becoming dominant in the Middle East, the recipient of huge amounts of military aid and one of the premier nuclear forces in the world? It's something to think about. Although While these thoughts are running through your head, ask yourself this question. If Kennedy, LBJ, and all subsequent administrations would have adhered to the 1950 Tripartite Declaration and did everything in their power to maintain balance in the Middle East instead of pushing Israel to the forefront, would our towers have been attacked on 9/11, 2001? And would we be on the verge of a possibly catastrophic war today? It's certainly something to ponder. CIA's role in JFK's assassination. Quite possibly the most important court trial of the 1990s, yes, even more relevant than OJ, was E. Howard Hunt versus the Spotlight newspaper. Although I won't delve into the circumstances surrounding it, juror Leslie Armstrong told the Spotlight in their November 11, 1991 issue, Mr. Lane, representing the defendant, was asking us, the jury, to do something very difficult. He was asking us to believe John Kennedy had been killed by our own government. Yet, if we examined the evidence closely, we were compelled to conclude that the CIA had indeed killed President Kennedy. This information is extremely important to 20th century history, yet the mainstream media gave it virtually no coverage due to its explosive nature. I suppose they were saving everything to see if OJ's glove fit. The vital point being made, and one confirmed by the Church Committee in 1975, was that a conspiracy to assassinate President Kennedy did exist, and that it extended directly into the U.S. government. To fully understand the ramifications of this information, one needs to be aware of what the CIA has been doing since it formed out of the OSS after World War II. Although time prevents me from engaging in a lengthy discourse, we should research Project Paperclip, where Nazi scientists were secretly relocated to America after the war. You can also investigate the CIA's illegal mind control experiments, their illicit drug tests on unwitting subjects, their drug trafficking activities, how they've successfully infiltrated the American corporate media, and their assassinations of various world leaders. In other words, these guys have and still are dirty up to their eyeballs. To fully understand not only this branch of intelligence, but also the broader spectrum of how our world works, we need to realize that what is depicted on the nightly news is not an accurate representation of reality. Rather, the true impetus or driving force behind our global political system is rarely ever seen by the American public. The real decision makers lurk in the shadows, plotting and planning, then using their operational arms, such as CIA, Mossad, other intelligence agencies, and organized crime, to do their bidding. As Michael Collins Piper tells us, these groups, the money launderers, drug dealers, killers, and crooks, are the only entities able to operate outside of societal laws and morals. The controllers, international bankers, heads of multinational corporations, and top-ranking members of secret societies guide our world, then use their implementers to carry forth their decisions. Politicians are one of the guises used in front of the scenes, while the CIA, Mossad, and mob take care of their dirty dealings, far removed from public scrutiny. I'm sorry to say, but this is the way our world operates. One of the primary reasons John F. Kennedy got assassinated was because he dared to interfere with this tenuous framework of power. More specifically, JFK, realizing how out of control these various agencies were, wanted to rein them in and bring them all under one roof, giving his brother Bobby jurisdiction over all of them. He also planned on getting rid of master manipulator J. Edgar Hoover, who was very aware of their plans, but out of sheer self-interest had no incentive to uncover the truth about Kennedy's murder. To make matters worse for himself, Kennedy fired CIA Director Allen Dulles, who was one of the dirtiest backroom wheeler-dealers of all time. Incredibly, Dulles would later serve on the Warren Commission. Talk about having the deck stacked against you. Arthur Kroc wrote, in the New York Times about this battle between Kennedy and the CIA on October 3rd, 1963, saying, "The CIA represents a tremendous power and total unaccountability to anyone." Kroc also referred to someone close to Kennedy in the White House who said if anyone ever tried to take over the U.S. government, it would be the CIA, and that JFK was no longer able to keep them in reins. Now remember, this was only a month and a half before that fateful day in Dallas. Reinforcing how out of control the CIA was at this time, attorney and researcher Mark Lane wrote in the Spotlight on February 17, 1992, President Kennedy sent Henry Cabot Lodge, his ambassador to Vietnam, with orders to the CIA on 2 separate occasions. And in both cases, the CIA ignored these orders, saying it was different from what the agency thought should be done. In other words, the CIA decided that it, not the president, would make the decision as to how American foreign policy should be conducted. Is this situation starting to become clear to you? Can you see what proportions the CIA had grown to? Kennedy was treading through very treacherous waters, but the straw that broke the camel's back was only reported years later by the New York Times on April 25, 1966. It seems Kennedy was so intent on exercising his elected powers and not allowing them to be usurped by power-crazed individuals in the intelligence community that he threatened to splinter the CIA in 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the wind. By uttering these words, Kennedy's fate was sealed, for now he had struck at the very core of the controller's power center. In essence, Michael Collins Piper points out Kennedy had done or intended to do 4 things that filled the CIA with rage. 1, he fired Allen Dulles. 2, he was in the process of founding a panel that would investigate the CIA's numerous crimes. 3, he put a damper on the breadth and scope of the CIA. 4, he limited their ability to act under National Security Memoranda 55. Colonel Fletcher Prouty spoke of the CIA's reaction. Nothing I have ever been involved with in my entire career had created such an uproar. NSAM 55 stripped the CIA of its cherished covert operations goal, except for some small actions. It was an explosive document. The military-industrial complex was not pleased." End quote. One of these incensed individuals was CIA Chief of Counterintelligence James Jesus Angleton. Assuming this post in 1954 under the guidance of 2 truly dirty dogs, Allen Dulles and Richard Helms, Peter Dale Scott wrote in Deep Politics and the Death of JFK that Angleton managed a second CIA within the CIA. Angleton operated so far beyond his legal parameters that he, along with William Harvey, formed the ZR rifle team and hired the shooters who were to take out Cuban leader Fidel Castro. And although I won't delve into details at this point, Piper points out in Final Judgment that these were the same triggermen used for the Kennedy assassination. More importantly, Angleton formed an extremely close relationship with the Mossad and David Ben-Gurion and was fully aware of the Israeli Prime Minister's hatred for JFK. Angleton became so intimate with the Israelis, he even helped them develop their secret nuclear program. While the CIA and Mossad became as one in the Middle East, a virtually indistinguishable entity working in unison to carry out their mutual goals. The Mossad, you must know, has been called by Michael Collins Piper the driving force behind the conspiracy to kill JFK. Andrew Cockburn, appearing on C-SPAN's Book Notes on September 1, 1991, described their relationship with American intelligence. There has been, since almost the earliest days of the Israeli state and the earliest days of the CIA, a secret bond, basically by which Israeli intelligence did jobs for the CIA and the rest of American intelligence. You can't understand what's going on with American covert operations and the Israeli covert operations until you understand this secret arrangement. Another extremely important point Michael Collins Piper brings up in Final Judgment is during the time of Kennedy's assassination, Yitzhak Shamir, later Israeli Prime Minister, was the head of a Mossad hit squad that hired a triggerman from the SDECE, French intelligence, to kill President Kennedy. This information is confirmed by the Israeli newspaper Haaretz on July 3, 1992, when they reported Yitzhak Shamir was once an underworld terrorist that became a Mossad agent, then later led an assassination team from 1955 to 1964. The Washington Times lends further credibility to this stance by reporting on July 4, 1992, that not only did this secret assassination team exist, but that they carried out attacks on perceived enemies and suspected Nazi war criminals, end quote. If you remember, David Ben-Gurion called JFK an enemy of the State of Israel. From my perspective, that would make him a perceived enemy. Now, if we consider for a moment Yitzhak Shamir hired one of the hitmen from France's Secret Service, the SDECE. What makes this situation even more bizarre is who James Jesus Angleton, the primary CIA force behind Kennedy's assassination, was with on the afternoon of November 22, 1963. It was Colonel George de Lenurian, deputy chief of the SDECE. They were both at CIA headquarters in Langley to get ready for hands-on damage control in case something went awry. In effect, we have the triangulation of three intelligence agencies, the CIA, Mossad, and SDECE, all converging around the murder of President Kennedy, while they made certain Lee Harvey Oswald had already established links with Cuba and the Soviet Union so that a communist Cold War cover story could be forwarded in the American press. How did these intelligence agencies pull it off? Well, let me leave you with a quote from retired Air Force pilot Fletcher Prouty that Michael Collins Piper used to shine some light on this situation. Prouty tells us, one of the primary necessary measures in an assassination plot is a process of removing or otherwise breaching the intended victim's blanket of security. He continues, no one has to direct an assassination. It happens. The active role is played secretly by permitting it to happen. This is the single greatest clue. Who has the power to call off or reduce the usual security precautions that are always in effect whenever a president travels? Now, who do you think had the ways, means, and motive to erase President Kennedy's security that afternoon in Dallas? The Russians? No. The Cubans? No. The mob? No. I'd place my bets on the CIA. Now are things starting to become clearer? As a side note, who do you think had the ways, means, and motivation to cover up the truth about the 9/11 terrorist attacks in the media? A group of ragtag terrorists or the CIA? It's something to consider. The CIA and organized crime, two sides of the same coin. Once a researcher strips away the veneer, wades through layers of illusion, disregards years of propaganda and misinformation, and finally sees history in its true perspective, they discover the entire world government, corporate-controlled global power structure is actually nothing more than a vast network of interrelated crime syndicates. Yes, crime syndicates. In this article, we briefly examine the Kennedy family's shadowy past and how certain alliances and betrayals with the Meyer-Lansky-led mob in conjunction with elements of the U.S. government and CIA ultimately resulted in JFK's assassination. As Michael Collins Piper so brilliantly points out, All of these groups, intelligence, government, and organized crime, are intimately connected and operate outside the law and public scrutiny to preserve and promote their self-interests. Regrettably, they all joined forces in 1963 to eliminate the last American president who wasn't bought, sold, and controlled by the globalist money interests. To understand how JFK found himself in such a quandary, on November 22, 1963, we must look back in time at his father, Joseph Sr. As many know, Old Man Kennedy built his fortune on illegal bootlegging, then by capitalizing on the stock market crash, i.e. inside information. But fewer people realize just how deeply Kennedy was linked with organized crime. To become so incredibly wealthy by running booze, Kennedy had to make agreements with some unseemly characters. Agreements that would later come back to haunt him. Another aspect of Joe Kennedy's personality that his family tries to sweep under the rug was his pro-Nazi sympathies. D. West Hooker, a New York City executive in the show business field and mentor, or George Lincoln Rockwell, founder of the American Nazi Party, said of Kennedy, Joe admitted when he was ambassador to England he had been pro-Hitler. However, in Kennedy's words, we lost the war. By we, he didn't mean the United States. When Kennedy said we, he meant the non-Jews. Joe Kennedy believed it was the Jews who had won World War II. He continues quoting Kennedy, I've done everything I can to fight the Jewish power over this country. I tried to stop World War II, but I failed. I've made all the money I need, and now I'm passing everything I've learned on to my sons. But before Joe Kennedy got his foot in the political door via an ambassadorship to England, he was a highly successful criminal that made many powerful enemies. One of them was Meyer Lansky, whose associate Michael Milan relates the following story in Final Judgment. Ask Meyer Lansky about Joe Kennedy and you'd see one of the few times that Mr. L would actually get conniptions. What they said back during Prohibition was, you can't trust Kennedy to keep his word. He stole from his friends so much he had no friends. And right before World War II, the son of a bitch turned around and said, we should all get on Hitler's side that the Jews could go to hell, end quote. This enmity between Kennedy and Lansky went all the way back to the 1920s in their bootlegging days. Michael Collins Piper tells us how Lucky Luciano and Lansky swiped an entire shipment of Kennedy's shine and killed off all his guards, causing him to lose a boatload of money. Thus, due to Kennedy's dishonesty and Lansky's fierce loyalty to his Jewish heritage, Milan said Lansky cursed the entire Kennedy family with revenge, then passed it down to his sons. Things got so bad, Joe Kennedy's life was actually on the line due to a mob order to hit. Luckily for Kennedy, Sam Giancana intervened and cut a deal for Old Man Kennedy to make things right with the mob again. To return his favor, Kennedy told Giancana once one of his sons made it to the White House, he'd have an in. To carry through on this promise, though, Old Man Kennedy would once again need Sam Giancana's help. If this information is hard for you to accept, remember, one of the most famous women JFK had an affair with, other than Marilyn Monroe, was Miss Judith Exner. And who was she? Sam Giancana's mistress. Also, according to David Heyman in A Woman Named Jackie, FBI papers and wiretaps prove JFK had direct person-to-person communications with Meyer Lansky during his 1960 presidential campaign. Plus, Sam Giancana himself is quoted as saying, I helped get Jack elected, and in return he calls off the heat. It'll be business as usual. As we all know by now, Sam Giancana was the key to JFK beating Richard Nixon in 1960 by giving him Chicago. Vote early and vote often. Problems arose when instead of turning their back on what the mobsters were doing, JFK and his brother Bobby double-crossed them and brought out the heat full strength. Now, Now, here's where things get sticky and we need to use some psychology. By all appearances, the Kennedy brothers going after the mob was one of the stupidest moves of all time. First, Old Man Kennedy was a bootlegger with intimate ties to organized crime. He knew how the mob thought and operated. Plus, he wanted a Kennedy presidential dynasty starting with Jack, followed by Bobby and Teddy. And with the likes of Sam Giancana behind them, they could rig other elections in the future. So, with all this in mind, why would Jack and Bobby start trying to throw them all in prison? It seems ludicrous. But John Kennedy was no dummy, not by a long shot. He knew that the longer his presidency extended, the more demands the mob would make of him. And, being that the Kennedys had plenty of skeletons in their closet, Jack's philandering plus Joe's Nazi sympathies and organized crime ties, JFK knew he would eventually be bribed and held hostage by the gangsters. If he didn't bow to their wishes, they'd start leaking this information to the press. And, considering how many people hated Kennedy, if the mob felt they weren't getting their fair share of the pie, i.e. government graft, they'd simply dangle Kennedy like a marionette on a string with continued threats of exposure. The entire scenario would have been a disaster for JFK, so Bobby and he decided to get rid of them. Of course, the mob couldn't overlook Bobby's efforts as the Attorney General, especially since Joe and Giancana had made a pact. Now, the Kennedy brothers were reneging, and such a stance could not be tolerated. Or, as Sam Giancana described the situation, it's a brilliant move on Joe Kennedy's part. He'll have Bobby wipe us out to cover their own dirty tracks, and it'll all be done in the Kennedy War on Organized Crime. Brilliant. Now, all of this subterfuge was bad enough for Kennedy, but when one adds the mob's long affiliation with the CIA, who also despised Kennedy, you can see how the flames were getting higher. And although I can't begin to elaborate on the varied ties between these two entities, Michael Collins Piper relates how the United States government began cavorting with Lucky Luciano and the Mafia during World War II, then progressed to Fidel Castro's assassination attempts, Operation Mongoose, and the ZR Rifle Team. Plus, transporting and dealing drugs out of the Golden Triangle while the Vietnam War was being waged. Sam Giancana described the CIA mob ties in very succinct terms. That's what we are, the outfit and the CIA, two sides of the same coin, end quote. Now, some people may wonder why other prominent political figures didn't expose this horrendous situation. They quite possibly could have, except for the fact they were in as deeply as the Kennedy family was. In Mafia Kingfish, publicized by McGraw-Hill, John Davies relates how Carlos Marcello filtered over $50,000 a year in payoffs to Lyndon Baines Johnson, while both James Jesus Angleton and Meyer Lansky had incriminating photographic evidence of J. Edgar Hoover relating to his homosexuality. Thus, he too was bribed into silence. To make matters even more precarious, Michael Collins Piper points out the ADL's links to organized crime and to the highly secretive COINTELPRO, where they gathered intelligence reports on high-ranking officials. These Jewish mobsters operated through the ADL and were also the same ones who legitimized and controlled the liquor industry, which was run by the Bronfman family. Now that I've mentioned a Jewish link to organized crime, I might as well delve into one of Michael Collins Piper's biggest contentions in Final Judgment. That Meyer Lansky was the capo di tutti capi, the undeniable leader of the vast underworld of organized crime, and that the Jews were the ones who actually called the shots while using the Italians as a front to take the heat and divert attention away from them. In this sense, the Jews were the real brains behind the mob, while all the other names, Giancana, Trafficant, Marcello, etc., were subordinates of Meyer Lansky. Hank Messick in Lansky, published by Berkeley Medallion Books in 1971, wrote, The real leaders of crime have remained hidden while the nation's law enforcement agencies have chased minor punks. He adds, mafia leaders of crime have been hiding behind the vendetta-ridden society, the Italian mafia, for decades. End quote. This perception has been reinforced in the public consciousness for years by Hollywood movies and TV shows. It is well known that the Jews founded Hollywood and still have a huge influence today, perpetrating the Italian mobster stereotype to this day with programs like The Godfather and The Sopranos. For those who don't believe Hollywood was founded by those of Jewish descent, look at the names of its founders. Universal Studios, Carl Laemmle, Jewish. 20th Century Fox, William Fox, Jewish. Warner Brothers, H.M. Warner, Jewish. Paramount Pictures, Adolf Zukor, Jewish. MGM, Samuel Goldwyn, Jewish. MGM, Louis B. Mayer, Jewish. Neil Gabler says in An Empire of Their Own, How the Jews Invented Hollywood, published by Crown in 1988, quote, the Hollywood Jews created a powerful cluster of images and ideas, so powerful that, in a sense, they colonized the American imagination. Ultimately, American values came to be defined by the movies the Jews made. Thus, similarly to the tactics used by the controllers where certain groups or individuals are in the forefront, here too the Italians became the fall guy while Lansky and his cohorts hid behind the scenes. As Michael Collins Piper shows, Meyer Lansky came to prominence via his drug-running operations, which subsequently brought him into contact with the OSS and naval intelligence through an endeavor called Operation Underworld. The headquarters for this operation were located at Rockefeller Center in New York City and were run by William Stevenson, who Ian Fleming patterned his James Bond character after. What follows is merely a thumbnail sketch of the interrelatedness between certain Jewish forces, the underworld, and secretive intelligence programs. And I certainly don't do it the justice that Michael Collins Piper does. Anyway, here goes. William Stevenson came to run anti-Nazi operations with the ADL and FBI, and later helped found the Mossad. The ADL eventually became an intelligence gathering and propaganda arm for the State of Israel. Stevenson's top man was Louis Bloomfield, who was a lawyer for the Bronfmans, illegal bootlegging and liquor magnates. Here is where things get wild. Stevenson and Bloomfield were also gun runners for the Jewish underground. In today's vernacular, they would be called terrorists, and they were the same people who became the government of Israel. So once again, this reiterates my point that the governments of the world are nothing more than a vast organized crime syndicate. They're all criminals. Anyway, it was Louis Bloomfield who coordinated the gun-running enterprises at the Jewish Sonborn Institute. And who helped him? The Bronfmans and Meyer Lansky. Lansky fits specifically into the picture because he set up the banks that were used to launder money for the Mossad. As a side note, if you don't think these types of illegal government operations exist today, check out Mike Rupert's The Truth and Lies of 9/11. Our government and many others still engage in money laundering, gun running, and drug trafficking on a large scale. Plus, if you look into the backgrounds of those people who run the world, the Bronfmans, Kennedys, Rockefellers, Bushes, those who founded Skull and Bones, and many others, you'll discover they are all criminals. And I don't mean the laughable Richard Nixon type, but hardcore, real-life, illegal type activities. Anyway, Meyer Lansky became so powerful that Anthony Summers relates in Conspiracy, McGraw-Hill, how, to protect his gambling, prostitution, and drug interests, he convinced the Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista to temporarily resign in the 1940s. Apart from his criminal enterprises and considering his Jewish heritage, Lansky, his other undying allegiance was to the State of Israel, to which he made enormous contributions. When he saw how incensed David Ben-Gurion was becoming because of JFK's refusal to assist or even permit Israel's nuclear aspirations, his long-standing grudge against the Kennedy family became deadly. And considering how Old Man Kennedy was a crook, the controllers felt a huge sense of betrayal when they went to such lengths to get John Kennedy into office. Then he turned and tried to destroy their two strongest enforcement and implementation arms, the CIA and the mob. Someone like Sam Giancana could never forgive Kennedy for pulling a switch on them, especially when Old Man Kennedy sold his soul to spare his life. By reneging on a long-standing deal, then retaliating with destructive force, JFK literally signed his own death warrant. The controllers were so irate after being double-crossed, they had to kill him. And since Michael Collins Piper asserts that Meyer Lansky was at the head of the organized crime power structure, he, along with the Mossad and James Jesus Angleton of the CIA, were the driving operational forces behind Kennedy's assassination. In the end, Sam Giancana best sums up the hit with these chilling words. These politicians and the CIA made it real simple. We'd each provide men for the hit. I'd oversee the outfit, mafia side of things, and throw in Jack Ruby and some extra backup, and the CIA would put their own guys on to take care of the rest. Vietnam and the CIA's illegal drug trafficking. Perhaps the biggest secret of the Vietnam War is that our Central Intelligence Agency seized control of the infamous Golden Triangle during that time period. Then, along with assistance from various elements of organized crime, shipped huge amounts of heroin out of that area into our country. Because piles of money were being made from this practice and many others, those who stood to profit from this horrendous war, the armament manufacturers, bankers, military men, and drug dealers, met any suggestion to withdraw from Vietnam with immediate consternation. But that's exactly what John F. Kennedy intended to do upon re-election. In fact, he already planned on telling the American people their troops would be back home by 1965. Think about this momentous decision for a moment. If we had exited Vietnam by 1965, 8 years of bloodshed in the jungles and civil unrest on America's streets and campuses could have been alleviated. Michael Collins Piper writes in Final Judgment, Kennedy's intended change in Vietnam policy, his plan to unilaterally withdraw from the imbroglio, infuriated not only the CIA, but elements in the Pentagon and their allies in the military-industrial complex. By this time, of course, the Lansky Syndicate had already set up international heroin running from Southeast Asia through the CIA-linked Corsican Mafia in the Mediterranean. The joint Lansky-CIA operations in the international drug racket were a lucrative venture that thrived as a consequence of deep U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia as a cover for drug smuggling activities. Piper's simple one-paragraph explanation may be the most concise overview of the Vietnam War ever written. The military men and defense contractors were making out like bandits from the war machine, while the CIA crooks and Lansky-led mobsters, via Santo Traficant as the major wheeler-dealer, were likewise padding their pockets. Author Peter Dale Scott, in Deep Politics and the Death of JFK, said of this phenomenon, the flood of drugs into this country since World War II was one of the major unspeakable secrets leading to the ongoing cover-up of the Kennedy assassination. To provide a broader perspective on this situation, Professor Alfred McCoy stated in The Politics of Heroin, since prohibition of narcotics in 1920, alliances between drug brokers and intelligence agencies have protected the global narcotics traffic. Given the frequency of such alliances, There seems a natural attraction between intelligence agencies and criminal syndicates. Both are practitioners of what one retired CIA operative has called the clandestine arts, the basic skill of operating outside the normal channels of civil society. Among all the institutions of modern society, intelligence agencies and crime syndicates alone maintain large organizations capable of carrying out covert operations without fear or detection. On the government side, the two main Golden Triangle runners were Ted Shackley and Thomas Clines, the same two men who ran Operation Mongoose, the plot to take out Fidel Castro. Thus, from 1960 to 1975, the CIA deployed a secret force of 30,000 Hmong tribesmen to fight the Laotian communists. They also created heroin labs in this area, then brought it out via their own private airline, Air America. In The Politics of Heroin, CIA Complicity in the Global Drug Trade, describes how the CIA first gave smack to our own American soldiers in Vietnam before shipping it into the United States, where Lansky mobsters dealt it on the streets. Sam Giancana's biographers reinforce this point by stating, while organized crime did its thing, the CIA looked the other way, allowing over 100 million a year in illicit drugs to flow through Havana into the U.S. It was an arrangement similar to all the rest they'd made. The CIA received 10% of the take on the side of narcotics, which they utilized for their undercover slush fund. After the mob and CIA generated this dirty money, they laundered it into secret bank accounts controlled by the international bankers. That way, government couldn't get their hands on it, and the funds could be invested in the stock market, loaned out to other businesses on the take, or channeled into Secret Service black budgets. So even though the above information is only the tip of the iceberg, do you see why it was so important to the CIA mobster international banker cabal that JFK didn't pull America out of Vietnam? The money via illegal drug trafficking and for the war machine was incredible, while control of another area of the globe, the Golden Triangle, was secured. As a final note, only 4 days after John Kennedy was assassinated, Lyndon Baines Johnson, his successor, put his name on NSAM 273, which secured our increased involvement in Southeast Asia. These guys weren't wasting any time. Within a few short months, our involvement in Vietnam went from 20,000 troops to 250,000. The CIA had won, and 10 years later, 57,000 American soldiers were dead. Truly shocking and abysmal behavior, an embarrassment and blight on the American consciousness. Media complicity in the Kennedy assassination. As I conclude this series on Michael Collins Piper's Final Judgment, the last piece of the puzzle that we need to examine is the media's role in covering up JFK's execution on November 22, 1963. As we've seen earlier, the organization with the greatest ways, means, and motive to pull off this heinous act was the CIA, with direct assistance from the Mossad and Meyer Lansky's International Crime Syndicate. To further indict the spooks at Langley, all one has to do is investigate how extensively they have infiltrated the American media during the latter half of the 20th century. And if anyone hollers conspiracy theory over these accusations, please remember this adage: something is no longer a theory once it has been proven to be true. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Carl Bernstein supports this point in his famous October 20th, 1977 article for Rolling Stone, when he wrote about how 400 CIA-funded journalists had infiltrated the American media under Operation Mockingbird. He wrote, "Joseph Alsop is one of more than 400 American journalists who in the past 25 years have secretly carried out assignments for the CIA, according to documents on file at CIA headquarters. Also, in the 1950s and 60s, CBS News was nicknamed the CIA broadcasting system." So we need to ask ourselves, Who had the resources and ability to implement the final step of this carefully crafted assassination? The answer is provided by Jerry Polikoff in Government by Gunplay, Signet Books. The Kennedy assassination cover-up has survived so long only because the press, confronted with the choice of believing what it was told or examining the facts independently, chose the former. To keep the people of this country confused, the media pushed every theory imaginable except that of Israeli involvement. As filmmaker Oliver Stone told the New York Times on December 20, 1991, when a leader of any country is assassinated, the media normally ask what political forces were opposed to this leader and would benefit from his assassination. But as Michael Collins Piper points out in Final Judgment, Oliver Stone failed to pursue the Israeli angle, possibly because the executive producer of his JFK movie was a man named Arnon Milchan, who Alexander Cockburn said in The Nation magazine on May 18, 1992, was probably Israel's largest arms dealer. In addition, Benjamin Beit Halami called Milchan a Mossad man. What our media was essentially called upon to do was 1. Forward and support the Warren Commission's findings. 2. Perpetuate the lone nut theory. 3. Attack dissenters. 4. Prevent any discussion of Israeli involvement. As Michael Collins Piper shows, at the center of this cover-up was WDSU Media, which was operated by the Stern family, who were major league contributors to the ADL. Working in conjunction with this news outlet and the major networks was CIA mastermind James Jesus Angleton. These forces were at the center of a conspiracy to feed the media false leads, misinformation, and to steer any investigation away from the true impetus of the Kennedy assassination. Quite possibly the most important factor that was ignored by the media was an entity named Permindex that acted as the point of convergence for the CIA, Mossad, and the Lansky mob. Who, you may ask, was Permindex? Permindex was a weapons supplier located in Rome that also laundered money and had ties to the CIA, Meyer Lansky, and the State of Israel. Although I won't be able to delve into this topic as thoroughly as Michael Collins Piper did in Final Judgment, below is a brief overview of this entity's role in the Kennedy assassination. The chairman of the board of Permindex was Major Louis Bloomfield, previously mentioned in this series, who was one of the two primary figures in establishing both the Mossad and the State of Israel. Bloomfield also held half the shares in Permindex, was employed by J. Edgar Hoover in FBI's infamous Division 5, and became a frontman for the powerful Bronfman family. The Bronfmans, you must remember, were bootleggers like Joe Kennedy, who built their empire via the Lansky crime syndicate. One of the other chief shareholders in Permindex was Tibor Rosenbaum, who established in Geneva an entity called BCI, Banque de Credit International. Rosenbaum was also the director of finance and supply for the Mossad, while his BCI was the main money laundering arms for Meyer Lansky. Finally, BCI was intimately connected with the Mossad, while its founder, Tibor Rosenbaum, was called the godfather of the Israeli nation. When we consider how crucial the State of Israel was to people like David Ben-Gurion and the above-listed men and how threatened they felt in regard to its very survival, it becomes more than coincidental that all these forces, the Mossad, CIA, and Lansky's mob, converged around Permindex. Each had direct ties to this entity and exactly had their own reasons as to why they wanted Kennedy dead. What angle did the American media pursue? The lone nut theory, where a stumblebum like Lee Harvey Oswald pulled off the biggest coup of the 20th century. It's beyond incredible. Then, to cover their tracks and eliminate their patsy, who was obviously going to start singing, the conspirators brought in Jack Ruby to kill Oswald. But again, the media failed in their duties to tell the truth. Rather than simply being a grieving American that felt compelled to kill Oswald to spare Jackie Kennedy any further heartache, Jack Ruby, real last name Rubenstein, was a member of Meyer Lansky's Jewish mob. Why didn't Time magazine let us in on this little tidbit of information? Or why hasn't journalist John Henshaw's lost film footage been released where Jack Ruby is led by Justice Department officials through Dallas Police Headquarters past the screeners, FBI agents, and detectives that were supposed to secure the premises? This is prime evidence. Why hasn't it ever been brought to the public's attention? More peculiar is Judge Earl Warren's decision to not let Jack Ruby testify before his commission. Why? Maybe it had something to do with the fact that the Warren Commission was stacked with members of the Council on Foreign Relations, a Bilderberg attendee, Gerald Ford, who was later rewarded with the presidency after Nixon was taken down, and Alan Dulles, who was fired by JFK. Think about how absurd this situation is. John Kennedy fired CIA Director Alan Dulles and threatened to shatter his organization into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the wind. Yet what happened? Alan Dulles was appointed to the Warren Commission to investigate the murder of the man who fired him, and whose organization was integral in his assassination. Researcher Dorothy Kilgallen told the Philadelphia News on February 22, 1964, "One of the best kept secrets of the Ruby trial is the extent to which the federal government is cooperating with the Department of Justice in Washington may provide the case with the one dramatic element it has lacked, mystery." There are countless other peculiarities that the media could have exposed, such as how the Kennedys had future large-scale plans to undermine the Rothschild-controlled Federal Reserve, and how it had a stranglehold on the American economy and money system, but instead they were content to sell their souls and say that the entire debacle was carried out by a lone nut assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald. And to this day, even though the Church Committee found in the 1970s that a conspiracy to kill President Kennedy existed and that our government was involved, the media and our public schools continue to advance the lone nut theory. Amazing. But Michael Collins Piper goes further, much further, listing the actual names of those who were responsible for John F. Kennedy's assassination, the primary planners who had firsthand knowledge of the murder, plus the secondary players on those on the periphery. I strongly urge all of you to purchase this book and find out for yourselves who is behind this grisly act. Once you dive inside Final Judgment, you'll see the roles each of the following entities played: the Mossad, the blackened heart; the CIA, the demented mind; the Lansky mob, the muscle; the American media, the blind eyes and muted mouth. Irv Lamar in Farewell America sums up the situation as such: President Kennedy's assassination was the work of magicians. It was a stage trick, complete with accessories and false mirrors, and when the curtain fell, the actors and even the scenery disappeared. But the magicians were not illusionists, but professionals, artists in their way. That's an incredible difference from a disillusioned lone nut assassin who pulled off this grandiose act all by himself. And if you think this horrendous situation has changed even one iota in the last 40 years, you're sadly mistaken. To prove this, I'll close with this excerpt from an interview with Greg Palast in the March edition of Hustler magazine. It concerns the premier cover-up artist, Dan Rather, whose entire career was made off the Kennedy assassination. Palast: "I feel sick at heart when I see Rather because he's actually a journalist. He came on my program, Newsnight, in England and said, 'I can't report the news. I'm not allowed to ask questions. We're going to send our children and our husbands into the desert now, and I can't ask a question because I will be lynched.' He looked defeated and awful, and I was thinking, Why am I feeling sorry for this guy who is worth millions? He should turn to the camera and say, well, now for the truth, over to you, Greg in London. The problem is he can't report the story of the intelligence agents who are told not to look at the bin Laden family, not to look at Saudi funding of terror. Hustler. What makes Rather afraid to do his job? Palast. It's not just that there are brutal shepherds like Rupert Murdoch out there to beat the dickens out of any reporter that asks the wrong questions. It's all about making news on the cheap. To some extent, they know there are certain things you cannot say. Rather says he would be necklaced for telling the truth. Regrettably, the cover-up that took place with the Kennedy assassination 40 years ago is exactly the same as it is today with the 9/11 cover-up. As yesterday, as today. Chapter 51, The Rothschild CFR Connection. On the surface, the JFK assassination seems fairly cut and dry. On November 22, 1963, in Dallas, Texas, our 35th president was gunned down in broad daylight while riding in his limousine through Dealey Plaza. But once we start digging a little deeper, we'll realize that this killing of the king nearly 40 years ago was one of the most complex events ever facing this nation. To show how complicated this matter has truly become, one needs to only look at how many pages have been devoted to the subject. Other than Jesus Christ and Adolf Hitler, there are probably more books about John F. Kennedy than any other figure in recent history. I have even dedicated a few sections of this book to this fateful day in Dallas. Thus, in a sea of so multiple theories and explanations, one needs to find a steady harbor to lay their anchor. Over the years, I found one of the most reliable sources of information was journalist Jim Marrs, author of the highly touted book Crossfire. Lisa Giuliani and I had the privilege of interviewing Mr. Marrs on April 7, 2002, and we asked him point blank about the Kennedy assassination. Jim replied, "The shortest answer as to who killed JFK is that, as president, he was shaking up the status quo, and the status quo struck back. This resulted in elements belonging to Operation Mongoose, the secret war against Castro, sending their mafia CIA military operatives to Dallas in November 1963. The cover-up, if not the assassination itself, carried the approval of the Council on Foreign Relations, as many CFR members participated in suppressing the truth." End quote. One of the most crucial decisions Kennedy made during his short-lived presidency was to pull out of Vietnam. In his seminal work, Rule by Secrecy, Jim Marrs shows how the United States became interested in Southeast Asia in 1951 when the Rockefeller Foundation created a study group comprised of members from the Council on Foreign Relations and England's Royal Institute on International Affairs. This panel concluded that there should be a British-American takeover of this area. Soon, these goals were being forwarded by John Foster Dulles, one of the CFR founders, and Eisenhower's Secretary of State, and his brother, CIA Director Allen Dulles. To understand how our global power structure operates, we need to know that people who funded David Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan were members of Britain's Round Table, founded by Cecil Rhodes and later headed by Lord Alfred Milner. And who directed the Round Table? Answer: the notorious Rothschild family. In addition, the CFR is a direct American descendant of the Round Table, which posed some serious problems for President Kennedy. Aware of how prevalent this organization was in every administration prior to his own, he stated at one point, "I'd like to have some new faces here, but all I get is the same old ones." Notice how President Kennedy crafted his words. He didn't say that he selected them, but who he gets. In other words, those who were already chosen for him. Who, you may wonder, comprised the CFR in the early 1960s? Answer: the New York banking establishment, which wasn't particularly pleased with the way Kennedy was pushing to break the Federal Reserve's power base. He did this by urging businesses to deposit, invest, and borrow from non-Federal Reserve banks. He also encouraged these non-Fed banks to deal directly with and underwrite state and local financial matters. By taking this leverage away from the Federal Reserve, Kennedy could ultimately return the power to coin money to Congress, which was how our founding fathers originally established it in our Constitution. If this happened, we could become fiscally sound once again by not being forced to pay inordinate amounts of interest to the international bankers. The president's plan was quite ingenious, and he knew what he was talking about, for economist Seymour Harris said that Kennedy was by far the most knowledgeable president of all time in the general area of economics. End quote. So what we had at the time in regard to the CFR banking establishment was a slew of individuals very upset by what JFK was trying to do. And who specifically were these people and institutions? We'll take a look in this list of heavy hitters that had aligned themselves against President Kennedy. Nelson Rockefeller, New York governor. David Rockefeller, Chase Manhattan Bank president, co-founder of the Trilateral Commission. Douglas Dillon, Kennedy's Treasury Secretary and CFR member. The Wall Street Journal. Fortune magazine editor Charles J.V. Murphy. Dean Rusk, Secretary of State, Iron Mountain panel member. Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense until 1968, later President of the World Bank and adjunct of the United Nations and CFR. McGeorge Bundy, National Security Advisor, Iron Mountain panel member. William Bundy, editor of the CFR Foreign Affairs. Averell Harriman, instrumental in promoting communism in the Soviet Union. Henry Cabot Lodge, U.S. Ambassador to Saigon. Joint Chiefs of Staff. John J. McCloy, Assistant Secretary of War, World War II, Kennedy advisor. Cyrus Vance, Secretary of the Army. Walt Rostow, State Department's Policy Planning Council, LBJ's National Security Advisor. Dean Acheson, Truman Secretary of State, Democratic Foreign Policy Advisor. As you can see, this was quite a formidable list of opponents, and not one to be taken lightly. Donald Gibson, a professor at the University of Pittsburgh, wrote in 1994's Battling Wall Street, The Kennedy Presidency, the establishment's rejection of Kennedy became increasingly intense during this time in office. He continued, many of the most important advocates of U.S. involvement in Vietnam, both within and outside the government, were members of the board of directors of the CFR. Gibson concludes this thought by adding, by the early 1960s, the Council on Foreign Relations, Morgan and Rockefeller interests, and the intelligence community were so extensively inbred as to be virtually a single entity. The above words are important to understand, for we are now clearly able to see that there were extremely powerful forces at work in the American financial, military, and intelligence communities, among others, who had a vested interest in promoting their business, banking, and Vietnam policies. And what were the motives of those who wanted us to remain in Vietnam? Well, beyond the obvious profits to be made from war, interest to be derived by bankers off of huge loans made to the U.S. and the opium market that would be cornered in the Golden Triangle, Vietnam came to epitomize a sinister Hegelian dialect at work. Here's the way it operated. First of all, a problem was created where the communist faction of the global elite's power structure took control of North Vietnam. thus creating a domino theory scenario that could be used as an excuse for the anti-communists. A supposed solution offered to the American people as a reason to draw them into war was to provide financial and military aid to South Vietnam. The resulting synthesis came about when the controllers expanded their influence into Southeast Asia and exploited the area economically while at the same time transporting heroin into the United States and around the world. So on one side, we have the CIA backing South Vietnam while the communists supported the North Vietnamese. And everyone, see the above list of names, was telling President Kennedy to send more troops into the area to carry out the controllers' goals. But Kennedy, unlike Harry Truman and Dwight David Eisenhower before him, wanted no part of this fiasco. In fact, on October 11, 1963, a little over a month before being assassinated, Kennedy approved of National Security Action Memorandum 263, which stated that the U.S. would pull out of Vietnam by 1965. To prevent this from happening, the powers that be orchestrated a scenario where bullets rang out in Dallas on November 22, 1963, and less than 2 years later, we have over 100,000 combat troops in Vietnam under codename Rolling Thunder. To show how prevalent the elitists were in this decision, President Kennedy's successor, LBJ, met on almost a daily basis with 14 of his Vietnam advisors, nicknamed the Wise Men. Of these 14 men, 12 were members of the CFR, and all were either bankers or lawyers. Yes, you read that correctly. Bankers and lawyers were making President Johnson's decisions in regard to Vietnam. Worse, as Jim Marrs points out in Rule by Secrecy, in 1985, a 26-page declassified congressional record report outlined the rules of engagement that were placed on our troops in Vietnam. As you read these restrictions, please hearken back to the military men who've said for years that they couldn't put their finger on it, but somehow felt as if they were being deliberately set up to lose the war. Now you know which forces were calling the shots in implementing this defeatist policy. It was the CFR-led bankers and lawyers working through LBJ who knew virtually nothing about foreign policy or war. (1985) Congressional Record, Rules of Engagement and Restrictions. 1. The Air Force could not attack prime targets that were determined by the military brass. 2. We could not fire upon the Viet Cong unless we were shot at first. 3. If a tank or truck was more than 200 yards off of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, they could not be attacked. 4. A North Vietnamese plane could not be shot at unless it was in the air and overtly offensive in nature. 5. Enemy missile sites being built could not be bombarded. 6. Vietnamese troops could not be tracked if they went into Laos or Cambodia. 7. The North Vietnamese were told that we could not attack certain installations, so guess what? That's where they put their anti-aircraft artillery to keep it safe. 8. Finally, arms and supplies that were necessary to perpetuate the war were permitted to go through the port of Haiphong, 80% of which came from the USSR and China. While the Vietnam War was still being waged, Louisiana Congressman John R. Rarick asked in no uncertain terms why the mainstream media was not telling us the truth about what was going on. Why doesn't CBS tell the American people about the CFR and let the people decide whom to blame for the Vietnam fiasco? The planners and top decision makers of a closely knit financial, industrial, intellectual aristocracy, or the military leaders under civilian control. Did you read the final two words, civilian control, not governmental control? Congressman Rarick was telling the American people that forces outside the government were pursuing an agenda contrary to what was in the best interest of the United States. He continued, "Who will tell the people the truth of those who control the right to know machinery also control the government?" Folks, this isn't a conspiracy theory. These are facts from a U.S. congressman in the know. People always ask, why doesn't anyone ever come forward with information that exposes the truth? Well, they do all the time, as I've repeatedly shown throughout this book. The only problem is those who call the shots from behind the scenes are also the same ones who own the mainstream media outlets and conceal the same information. Someone could then ask, what about all the various theories as to who killed John F. Kennedy? Some people say it was the Masons, the Jesuits, the Israelis, the CIA, mob, or Russians. Who is actually behind the assassination? In an email dated February 11, 2003, Jim Marrs covered quite a few topics surrounding this tragic event. First, he explained that being a reporter and native of the Lone Star State who was intimately acquainted with Texas politics at the time, none of the above-mentioned groups could have had such control over the Dallas police, Texas authorities, the mob, the FBI, the CIA, or the anti-Castro Cubans. According to Jim Marrs, someone well beyond any of these entities was calling the shots. The real power, he says, lies with the Rothschild family who control the Bank of England. Everything else filters down through the Rothschilds, all the implementers in politics, business, industry, media, intelligence, banking, and even the State of Israel. Jim Marrs has finally pieced all together as he writes in his email. Baron Edmund Rothschild built the first oil pipeline from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean and founded the Israeli General Bank. He is now known as the father of modern Israel. So, the Rothschilds' banking empire created and controls Israel, and Israeli campaign contributions influence and dominate the U.S. Congress, not to mention the mass media and U.S. foreign policy, along with the Rothschilds, American agents, which include the Rockefellers. England's desire to control all the Iraqi oil sources is behind the Bush bid for war. In fact, the Bushes are blood relatives of the royal Windsor family. It is not that England is such a great ally to us, but the other way around. We are dancing to England's tune, as is Israel. And all are being played off against each other. For far too many years, assassination investigators were distracted by arguing over who killed him: the military, the CIA, FBI, mob, right-wingers, oilmen, anti-Castro Cubans. The correct answer was all of the above, as they were all working together under Operation Mongoose. Here is where the operational orders came from. JFK was his own man after his father suffered a stroke. He was out of control and actually believed he was president and was looking out for the best interests of the American public. The New World Order had him killed and then instigated the ridiculous Warren Commission, dominated by CFRs and Doles and McCloy. There is some truth to Michael Collins' Piper theory, but it goes far beyond the borders of Israel. The same game is being played today. We must look up toward the real rulers, the ones who created communism, Nazism, and all the other isms which they employ to keep us off balance, fearful, and at each other's throats. Chapter 52, Notes and Quotes. Regicide, the official assassination of John F. Kennedy by Gregory Douglas. One of the bullets used to kill President Kennedy was filled with mercury, and upon penetrating his body, the shell exploded, guaranteeing instantaneous death. I suppose the fact that his brain was splattered all over the limousine, his wife, and one of the Secret Service agents behind him also had something to do with his demise. This type of ammunition was a trademark of European triggermen and was the primary reason why Kennedy's brain disappeared. Those behind the killing could not allow this mercury additive to be discovered by the doctors, thus lending less credibility to Lee Harvey Oswald's role in the assassination. 2. A Russian intelligence study translated and analyzed by Army Colonel Victor B. Driscoll in the Driscoll Report confirmed a Defense Intelligence Agency DIA report prepared in 1978 purporting that an extensive homosexual underground existed in connection to the Kennedy assassination. These reports verify that Lee Harvey Oswald and CIA operative Georges D. Mohrenschildt were homosexuals, while Jack Ruby was bisexual. When added to the fact that other key figures such as Clay Shaw and pilot David Ferry, along with his roommate Raymond Roshiers, were also flamboyant homosexuals, along with transvestite homosexual J. Edgar Hoover and his longtime assistant Clyde Tolson, known as J. Edna and Mother Tolson. What we see emerging is another aspect of the Kennedy case kept concealed by the government, Warren Commission, and the media. In his book, The Bureau, My 30 Years in Hoover's FBI, William Sullivan even goes so far as to say that Robert F. Kennedy's commonly referred to Hoover as an old faggot. 3. These same Russian intelligence and DIA reports state that Lee Harvey Oswald was an agent for both the U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence, run by the CIA, and a paid FBI informant. In other words, he worked in varying capacities for the United States government. 4. U-2 spy plane DIA report. Internal CIA documents show very clearly that as their very existence was dependent on a continuation of the Cold War, any diminution of East-West hostility could easily lead to their own downsizing over the office of the President and also of U.S. foreign policy. It was proposed, according to top-level CIA reports, to somehow use their U-2 flights to create an increase in tension that could lead to a frustration of any détente that might result from a lessening of international tensions." End quote. 5. Jack Ruby's murder, DIA report. Jack Ruby was given an injection of air with a syringe which produced an embolism that killed him. The official cause of Ruby's death was a blood clot. Ruby's fatal blood clot was the result of outside assistance. Russia's intelligence study confirms his claims, stating information indicates he was given a fatal injection. End quote. 6. The Warren Commission, DIA report. A written comment by Chief Justice Earl Warren to former CIA Director Alan Dulles was that people like Lane, New York attorney Mark Lane, author of Rush to Judgment, should never be permitted to air their radical views, at least not before the commission, end quote. 7. CIA ties to organized crime. Driscoll report. American gangsters had very close relations with the Central Intelligence Agency. This relationship began during the World War II, when the American OSS made connections with Sicilian members of the American gangs in order to assist them against the fascists, Mussolini. The man who performed this liaison was James Jesus Angleton, later head of counterintelligence. This is confirmed by the 1978 DIA report. The connections of Angleton, chief of counterintelligence for the CIA, with elements of the mob are well known in intelligence circles. Angleton worked closely with the Sicilian and Naples mobs in 1944 onwards as part of his duties for the OSS. 8. The basis for President Bush's "You're either for us or against us" motto, Russian intelligence study. American foreign policy was, and still is, firmly in the hands of the CIA. No nation is permitted to be neutral. All have to be either in the U.S. camp or are its enemy. Most often, American businesses are paramount in the determination as to which country will receive U.S. support and which will not only be denied this support but attacked. End quote. 9. The Cold War. Author Gregory Douglas claims that the Cold War was an engineered affair, and its chief architect was former German Army General Reinhard Gehlen, a former head of the Soviet military intelligence section of the Wehrmacht. End quote. He did this in 1948 by fabricating a report for the CIA, which claimed the Russians had amassed artillery divisions on the European border and were set to attack. The controller's motivation was twofold. One, it would be a legitimate excuse for both the U.S. and USSR military to increase in size via loans from the international bankers, and two, it would bolster the U.S. economy, which began to slump once again after World War II, i.e., war equals profits. Gehlen was employed by the U.S. Army in 1948 and then became a paid CIA employee until 1956. 10. Staged government attacks upon the U.S. Operation Northwoods was a U.S. Joint Chief of Staff's ploy to invoke American hatred against Fidel Castro so that they would support an invasion of Cuba. What they wanted to do was sink ships in the Atlantic Ocean, hijack aircrafts, set off bombs in U.S. cities, and destroy civilian airplanes. Does this sound familiar to 9/11? 11. Other possible assassination plots against President Kennedy. A. February 1963. Blow up the president's airplane. B. Have Kennedy's doctor put deadly substances into his amphetamine injections. C. Blow up his boat off the Massachusetts coast. Operation Zipper, official code name for the assassination of President Kennedy. 13. Hitmen. The 4 assassins were recruited by famed mobster Sam Giancana from the Corsican Mafia, Union Corse in Marseilles, Italy. The government contact was Robert Trumbull Crowley, Deputy Director of Operations for the CIA. Crowley met twice with Giancana at the Drake Hotel in Chicago. Meanwhile, CIA Director John McCone reigned in the FBI while James Jesus Angleton got the Army and Joint Chief of Staffs on board. In April 1963, the triggermen were selected, each being promised $100,000 apiece, and were overseen by former FBI agent and CIA Berlin operative William King Harvey. Angleton also brought on Israeli counterintelligence agent Amos Manor, head of the Shin Beth, to also coordinate the operation. This Israeli unit's main task was to kill the assassins after they took out Kennedy. This took place in Maryland, where 3 were eliminated after being flown out of Dallas by David Ferry, while a 4th returned to Marseilles. 14. CIA drug trafficking. Author Gregory Douglas, with increasing American military involvement in Vietnam and Laos, the increase in opium smuggling was highly significant and has not stopped to this day. It is a published fact that much of the movement of raw opium from the so-called Golden Triangle was affected by the CIA and its Air America private air force. He concludes this paragraph by stating unequivocally that the U.S. government is one of the primary drug traffickers in the world. 15. The CIA and the media. Frank Gardner Wisner, head of CIA clandestine operations, was one of the primary forces in infiltrating the American and foreign media. Quote from the author, "By a judicious mixture of bribery, special favors, and outright payments of cash, Wisner and his associates could powerfully influence American perceptions and completely silence any media opposition." Prominent academics, revered newspaper columnists, historical writers, newspaper and magazine editors, book publishers, and later television executives all gorged at the CIA pig trough, end quote.